Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hello, my dear friends. Tonight we're diving into something that'll probably surprise you. Medieval people were just as interested in altering their consciousness as you are. Picture it. You're sitting in a smoky tavern, torchlight dancing across stone walls, and someone hands you a cup of something that tastes like it was fermented in a boot. But it's the only escape you've got from a life where dentistry doesn't exist, and your house shares walls with livestock. The smell of incense curls through the air from the monastery next door, and you're wondering if it's really just religious devotion or if Brother Cathbutt is getting a little too transcendent during evening prayers. Here's the reality check that'll keep you up, or rather help you fall asleep, thinking about it. We tend to imagine medieval people as purely religious, purely suffering, purely focused on surviving winter. But the truth is darker, weirder, and honestly kind of hilarious. They were using plants, fungi, fermented grains, and straight-up dangerous substances to get high in ways that would make modern drug dealers nervous. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you are right now. I'm always curious where my listeners are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You see, the medieval period wasn't some monolithic block of gray suffering followed by the Renaissance, suddenly inventing fun. It was 1,000 years of people doing what humans have always done, finding ways to escape, to connect, to feel something other than the baseline misery that came with living in a world without antibiotics, anesthesia, or reliable food sources. The substances changed. The methods varied by region and social class, but the impulse stayed constant. A peasant in England might chew poppy seed pods in the field while working, while a wealthy merchant in Venice could afford exotic spices that cost more than a horse. A monk in a monastery garden could justify growing plants that nobody really needed for medicine. A woman living on the edge of town who knew too much about herbs and fungi might be celebrated as a healer until someone had a bad trip, and suddenly she's accused of witchcraft. What's genuinely fascinating is that medieval people didn't have our vocabulary for what they were doing. They didn't call it getting high or recreational drug use or self-medication. They called it medicine. They called it spiritual experience. They called it taking the edge off a brutal day, and they were doing it with almost everything available to them. Fermented grain, fermented honey, fermented fruit, plants that grew wild in every forest, fungi that sprouted after rain, expensive spices imported from places most of them would never see. Some substances were socially acceptable because they were tied to religion or medicine. Some were dangerous enough that entire towns went mad from contaminated bread, and nobody figured out why. Some were expensive enough that only nobles could afford them, which made them status symbols in a world where your clothes and your access to intoxication were basically the only ways to prove you weren't a peasant. The scholars who studied this stuff, historians, botanists, pharmacologists, they're still arguing about exactly how much medieval people understood about what they were using. Did they know poppy seeds contained opiates, or did they just notice that eating them made pain go away? Did monks deliberately cultivate hallucinogenic plants in their gardens? Or were they just following old herbals that had been copied and recopied without anyone questioning why certain plants were listed? Were the witch trials partly driven by substance use? People having experiences they couldn't explain, attributing them to demons and then deciding that the person who suggested they try that plant was definitely working with Satan. What you're going to discover over the next few hours is that medieval consciousness alteration wasn't some weird edge case or moral failing that the church managed to stamp out. It was embedded in the society, woven through medicine and religion and agriculture and trade. It was present at weddings and funerals, in monasteries and taverns, in the hands of healers and apothecaries, and monks and traveling merchants. It was sometimes celebrated, sometimes condemned, sometimes just accepted as part of how things were. And understanding it doesn't just tell you something weird about the past. It tells you something true about human nature. We're all looking for the same things: escape, connection, relief from pain, a break from the grinding monotony of existence. The journey you're about to take will wind through forests where dangerous plants grew wild, through monastery gardens that were simultaneously places of holy devotion and botanical experimentation, through taverns where the only way to forget your problems was to drink yourself into a state where your problems seemed slightly less pressing, through the workshops of apothecaries who sold you medicine and poison in the same breath, depending on the dose. You'll meet monks who brewed beer so consistently, excellent it became a measure of their piety. Herbalists whose knowledge was so valuable and so dangerous that their gender made them targets for accusation. Traders who brought back substances from distant lands that nobody quite understood. You'll learn why a spice that you now sprinkle on your dessert could have sent a medieval person into a state of complete ego dissolution. You'll understand why entire villages sometimes went mad and nobody could figure out what was wrong. But mostly, you're going to realize that the medieval people who got high weren't that different from you. They had the same basic human need to escape, the same curiosity about consciousness, the same desire to feel less alone in a world that was genuinely, objectively difficult to survive in. They just didn't have Spotify or video games or the internet to distract them, so they had to get creative. And somehow, despite not having chemistry or pharmacology or even really reliable record-keeping, they figured out an astonishing variety of ways to alter their consciousness. Some of those ways were medicinal, some were spiritual, some were just desperate. All of them were human. So settle in. This is going to be a long, winding journey through the highs and lows of medieval consciousness alteration. And I do mean that literally. We're going through the actual chemical experiences, the substances, the context, the culture, and the consequences. By the time we're done, you'll understand not just what medieval people used to get high, but why they did it, who had access to it, what happened when it went wrong, and why understanding this stuff matters for understanding medieval society in general. The night is long, you've got time. Let's go. You've always been looking for it, haven't you? That thing that makes you feel different from the baseline of existence. Maybe it's a particular song that gives you goosebumps, or the way your body feels. L's after exercise, or that moment when you're about to fall asleep and everything gets a little abstract. Maybe it's actual substances, coffee to wake up, alcohol to relax, whatever else you're honest enough to admit, or not honest enough to mention. The point is, seeking altered states of consciousness isn't something that started in the 1960s, or with the invention of medicine, or with the discovery of psychoactive plants. It's as old as humans are. We're wired to seek it out. There's a part of your brain that's constantly evaluating whether you're in the right neurochemical state. And if you're not, it's always looking for a way to get there. Medieval people felt exactly the same way, except their baseline existence was so much worse than yours that you almost can't comprehend the desperation. You're tired. They were exhausted. You had a bad day at work. They might have starved to death or gotten an infected cut that killed them, or watched their child die of a disease that a single antibiotic would have cured. You're dealing with anxiety about the future. They were dealing with the concrete certainty that life was short, painful, and mostly out of their control. So when they found something that made them feel differently for a while, something that made the pain go away, or made them feel connected to something larger, or made them feel less alone, or just made them feel less, they did it. The thing that's really important to understand is that medieval people didn't make the distinction we make between medicine and drugs and recreational substances. A plant was a plant. If it made you feel different, then it did something. If it made you feel better, then it was medicine. If it made you feel good, then it was a benefit. And the question of whether you should be feeling that way didn't really come up. The church would eventually develop concepts around sin and temptation and the dangers of the flesh. But even the church couldn't quite settle on whether altering consciousness was inherently wrong. After all, they had communion, which was supposedly the actual physical transformation of bread into flesh and wine into blood through the power of God. They had incense that filled the senses. They had rituals that were designed to move you emotionally and spiritually. They had prayer and music and imagery, all designed to alter your mental state in socially approved ways. So the baseline medieval person, say a peasant, living in England around the year 1200, they would have had regular access to alcohol, because water wasn't safe to drink, and everyone understood that fermenting grain or fruit made it safe and also made you feel different. They would have had access to plants that grew wild, poppies that you could chew the seed pods from, herbs that you could make into tea. If they lived near a monastery, they might have had access to more exotic things, because monks grew almost everything. If they were wealthy, they might have had access to spices that came from distant lands and cost more than gold, some of which had psychoactive properties that people were vaguely aware of, but didn't fully understand. If they were a woman who knew about plants and healing, they had knowledge that was valuable enough to be dangerous, knowledge that could make them a healer or a witch, depending on context and luck. What's crucial to understand is that the seeking of altered consciousness in medieval times wasn't some shameful secret or fringe activity. It was woven through the culture in ways that were completely normalized. Drinking alcohol wasn't something you hid. It was basic survival, because the water would kill you. Using poppy-based medicines wasn't controversial. Every physician recommended it for pain. Burning incense in church wasn't about getting high, or was it? Growing plants in monastery gardens wasn't about recreational use, or was it? The ambiguity is the whole point. Medieval people could do things that altered their consciousness and frame them in ways that were completely legitimate and acceptable because the framing was genuine. The monk who brewed beer wasn't a drug dealer. He was a skilled craftsman producing a necessary food. The herbalist woman who knew which plants gave you visions wasn't a drug manufacturer. She was a healer. The trader who brought back exotic spices wasn't smuggling intoxicants. He was bringing luxury goods to the wealthy. But underneath all of that legitimacy and framing, something else was happening. People were seeking out specific substances because of how those substances made them feel. They were dosing themselves based on experience. They were sharing knowledge about which plants worked and which didn't. They were, in other words, engaging in drug use in almost every meaningful sense of the term, just without calling it that. And because they didn't call it that, because the cultural and religious framework allowed for it, they were doing it more openly and more systematically than you might expect. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually understood the pharmacological properties of what they were using, or whether they were just following tradition and folk knowledge without really comprehending the mechanism. And that's an interesting question, but in some ways it misses the point. They didn't need to understand the chemistry to understand the effect. They didn't need to know about alkaloids and neurotransmitters to notice that eating poppy seeds made pain less sharp, or that drinking fermented honey made them feel lighter, or that certain plants made them see things that weren't there. They were doing empirical drug research without calling it that. Sting substances, sharing results, accumulating knowledge across generations. The medieval world was filled with people who were in various ways and to various degrees seeking consciousness alteration. Some of them were seeking it to escape physical pain. Some were seeking it for spiritual reasons. They genuinely believed that altered states could bring them closer to God or give them visions of truth. Some were seeking it for social reasons. Getting drunk at a tavern was how you belonged to a community. Some were seeking it out of genuine desperation. If you're living in constant pain and fear and hunger and something makes that better for a few hours, you're going to use it. And some were seeking it simply because consciousness alteration feels good, and the human brain likes to feel good, which is something we don't like to admit about medieval people because we imagine them as purely motivated by survival and piety. But it's true, nonetheless. What emerges from looking at medieval consciousness alteration is a picture of a society that was doing almost everything you can do with psychoactive substances, but under different names and within different frameworks. They had their alcoholics, they had their addictions, they had their casual users, they had their people who never touched anything. They had dangerous overdoses and bad trips, and people whose substance use got them killed or imprisoned or labeled as witches. They had the same range of human responses that you see today, just in a context where everything was more dangerous, less regulated, more woven through religion and medicine and daily life. And understanding that, really understanding it, changes how you think about medieval people. They weren't some alien civilization that operated according to completely different rules and values. They were people like you, experiencing the same basic human drives and seeking solutions to the same basic human problems. They just did it with whatever was available, which happened to be a remarkable array of psychoactive plants, fermented grains, and dangerous fungi. Let's go back to the absolute beginning, because understanding medieval consciousness alteration requires understanding how people first figured out that fermented grain could do something interesting to your mind. You have to imagine a moment, and historians can't pin down exactly when this was, but it was a very long time ago when someone left grain in water and nature did its work. Yeast is everywhere. It's in the air. It's on the grain itself. And when you create the right conditions, it multiplies and starts breaking down sugars and producing alcohol and carbon dioxide. Someone drank the result and felt different, and then other people tried it and they felt different too. And suddenly you had something that changed how humans functioned, and it was available without anyone having to understand the chemistry. This happened probably in the Neolithic period, maybe 10,000 years ago, or more, and it was genuinely accidental. But once it happened, once someone discovered that grain plus water plus time equals something that makes you feel less terrible, that knowledge didn't go away. It spread. It became part of how people processed grain. It became so fundamental to survival that it integrated into culture and religion and medicine. By the medieval period, fermented grain, specifically beer, was so central to human society that children drank it, not because people were trying to get their kids drunk, but because the water wasn't safe and beer was. A medieval child might have consumed what we would consider a significant amount of alcohol, just as part of normal daily eating. But here's where it gets interesting. The medieval period inherited thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about fermentation. They understood on a practical level how to make alcohol. They understood that different grains produce different results. They understood that you could add different things to the mix to change the flavor and properties. They understood that alcohol could be made stronger through heating and concentration. They understood that alcohol helped preserve things, that it could be used as medicine, that it made people feel different, and that some people got addicted to it and ruined their lives. They understood all of this without understanding chemistry, just through the accumulated weight of practical experience. So by the time we get to the medieval period proper, let's say the years between roughly 500 and 1500 CE, fermented grain, particularly beer, is absolutely foundational to European society. And it's not some shameful vice or secret pleasure. It's woven so deeply into the culture that it's just normal. You wake up and drink beer. You work and drink beer. You go to church and drink beer. You have a meal and drink beer. You're sick and someone gives you herbal beer to help with recovery. Your baby is crying and beer helps soothe it. Beer is everywhere because water is genuinely dangerous, and alcohol kills the bacteria that makes water dangerous. What's really fascinating is how much care medieval people put into fermentation. You've got monks specifically dedicated to brewing beer to a consistent standard. You've got regional varieties of beer that people have strong opinions about. You've got brewing techniques that are closely guarded secrets, passed down through families or monastic communities. You've got beer that's considered better or worse based on criteria that we'd now recognize as relating to the alcoholic content, the flavor profile, the clarity, the stability. Medieval people were doing quality control on psychoactive substances without calling it that. But fermentation didn't stop at grain. Medieval people fermented fruit. Grapes became wine, and wine was even more central to European culture than beer, particularly among the wealthy and in Mediterranean regions. They fermented honey and got mead, which had a special status because honey was expensive, and therefore mead was a luxury item. They fermented apple juice into cider. They fermented pear juice into perry. Every medieval region and culture developed its own fermented beverages, and all of them contained alcohol, and all of them made you feel different. And the level of consciousness alteration depended on how strong the fermentation was and how much you drank. The thing that's really important to recognize is that this wasn't just recreation or escape, although it was partly that. Fermented beverages were integral to medieval survival. They provided calories. You could survive for a long time on bread and beer, because beer had nutritional content. They provided hydration because the water you drank raw would kill you. They provided medicine because alcohol actually does have some medicinal properties, and it was used to try to treat infection and pain. They provided social bonding because drinking together was how communities formed and maintained relationships. They provided religious experience because alcohol was part of sacred rituals. And yes, they provided consciousness alteration, that feeling of being less, of escaping your own mind for a while, of feeling disconnected from the constant pain and fear and hunger of medieval existence. What medieval people were doing with fermented grain was engaging in something that's surprisingly sophisticated. They had understood through observation and experimentation that you could manipulate natural processes to create substances that altered consciousness. They developed methods to control those processes and achieve consistent results. They had integrated those substances into every level of their society. They had created rituals and culture around the use of those substances. They had social rules about how much you could drink, when you could drink, what drinking meant, about your status and your character. They had people whose job it was to produce fermented beverages with high skill and consistency. They had the equivalent of drug dealers, tavern keepers, and brewers who made their living off the production and distribution of these consciousness-altering substances. And here's the thing that's easy to miss. They did all of this with genuine religious sanction. The church didn't just tolerate fermented beverages. The church actively supported them. Monks brewed beer. Clergy drank wine as part of sacred ritual. Monasteries were centers of fermentation, technology, and production. This wasn't the church condemning intoxication and people doing it anyway, in secret. This was the church as a major player in the production and distribution of consciousness-altering substances. The distinction between sacred and profane, between medicine and recreation, was blurry enough that you could be pious and an alcoholic at the same time. And the church would support both. Historians still debate the exact nutritional and social role of fermented beverages in medieval life, whether they were so central to survival that you literally couldn't have a functioning society without them, or whether that's overstating it a bit. But everyone agrees that they were foundational in a way that's hard to overstate. Medieval society ran on fermented grain. The calories from beer and bread and wine made survival possible for millions of people, and as a side effect, or maybe as an integral effect, everyone was regularly consuming substances that altered their consciousness. What you're looking at essentially is the creation of a society-wide system for consciousness alteration that was so normalized it was invisible. People weren't thinking of themselves as getting high. They were thinking of themselves as surviving, as participating in culture, as meeting religious obligations, as being social. But underneath all of that, they were regularly consuming alcohol. And alcohol changes how your brain works. And they were doing it collectively, systematically, and with remarkable consistency across the medieval period and across the European continent. The medieval person who woke up and drank beer, worked all day and drank beer, went to church and drank beer, ate dinner and drank beer, went to sleep. That person was experiencing a kind of continuous low-level consciousness alteration that was just normal. It was baseline. It was what life was like. And building on that foundation, there were people who were seeking more intense consciousness alteration through stronger fermented beverages, or by deliberately drinking to intoxication. And there were people who were using fermented beverages as medicine in ways that took advantage of their consciousness-altering properties. And there were people who were experimenting with adding other substances to fermented beverages to increase their effects or create new effects. All of this started with grain plus water plus time equals something that makes you feel different. It evolved into a society-wide system of consciousness alteration that nobody thought of as consciousness alteration because it was just normal, just survival, just how things were done. And that's the foundation on which everything else builds. Now we need to talk about wine specifically, because wine was something else entirely, where beer was the drink of common people, where it was nutritional necessity and casual intoxication rolled into one. Wine was different. Wine was expensive, at least until you got to Mediterranean regions, where grapes grew easily. Wine was status. Wine was culture. Wine was something that separated the wealthy from the poor in a way that was immediately visible. If you were drinking wine, you were announcing to the world that you could afford it, which meant you had money, which meant you had power. But wine wasn't just about status. Wine was absolutely central to medieval Christianity. The entire sacrament of communion revolved around wine, or rather around the theological transformation of wine into the blood of Christ. The church had a vested interest in maintaining wine production and distribution. Monasteries owned vineyards. Bishops understood the wine trade. Wine wasn't just allowed in the church, it was sacred. You could be a priest and spend your time focused on producing good wine because that was literally part of your religious duty. Here's the thing that most people don't realize about medieval wine. It was not the wine you drink now. If you had a bottle of medieval wine and drank it in the present day, you might find it surprising, possibly disgusting. Medieval wine was often weak, maybe 8 to 12% alcohol. But more importantly, it was unstable. It would ferment and then re-ferment. It would develop weird flavors. It would sometimes turn into vinegar. Wine storage was a serious problem. You couldn't just buy wine and keep it for years. It would go bad. So wine was something you had to consume relatively quickly, or you had to keep producing it, or you had to develop ways to preserve it, which is where things got interesting. Medieval people understood that you could boil wine, concentrate it, and increase the alcohol content. You could also add things to wine to preserve it and change its properties. You could add herbs. You could add spices. You could add spices. You could add honey. You could heat it and add resins. In other words, wine became the base for medieval chemistry and experimentation with consciousness-altering substances. Wine was the vehicle through which other things were delivered and consumed. Wine wasn't just wine, it was the platform on which medieval consciousness alteration was built, at least among the wealthy. The wealthy medieval person who could afford wine had access to something that the peasant didn't have: variety. If you were rich, you could have different wines: Spanish wine, Italian wine, French wine, wine from different regions and different years and different qualities. If you were really rich, you could have wine that had been mixed with herbs and spices and other things to create specific effects, and could have wine that was, supposedly, medicinal. You could have wine that was meant to increase vitality, or create euphoria, or cure melancholy, or improve digestion, or increase sexual performance. This is where we start to see the overlap between wine and what we would now call medicine or drugs. Because medieval medicine, particularly the medicine practiced by physicians and apothecaries, rather than folk healers, was heavily based on wine. If you wanted to administer a medicine, you dissolved it in wine. If you wanted to make something taste better or be easier to consume, you put it in wine. If you wanted something to absorb faster, you put it in wine. Wine was the delivery mechanism for everything else. So the wealthy person who was drinking wine mixed with exotic herbs and spices wasn't just drinking to feel different, although they probably were, at least partly. They were participating in medicine. They were receiving treatment. They were being responsible about their health. But here's the beautiful thing about that framing. It allowed for a lot of substances to be consumed that would otherwise be contract. Oversile. If you mixed something into wine and called it medicine, then drinking it wasn't a vice. It was healthcare. And if that medicine happened to make you feel euphoric, or have interesting visions, or lose your sense of pain, well, that was a beneficial side effect of the treatment. The wealthy medieval person could therefore do a lot of consciousness alteration under the guise of medicine in ways that were completely socially acceptable. Wine culture in medieval Europe was also social in a specific way. You drank wine at special occasions. You drank wine to celebrate or mourn. You drank wine when you were negotiating business deals. You drank wine when you were making peace or declaring war. Wine was involved in marriage ceremonies. Wine was involved in coronations. Wine was the drink of ceremonies and importance. And if drinking wine altered your consciousness slightly, and it did because it had alcohol and sometimes had other things in it too, then that consciousness alteration was part of the significance of the occasion. What's also interesting is how wine connected medieval European culture to the ancient world and to other cultures. Wine was something that Romans had drunk, which made it classical and therefore valuable. Wine was something that was traded from distant places, which made it exotic and therefore desirable. Wine was something that took time and skill to produce well, which made it a marker of civilization. Wine wasn't just a substance that altered consciousness. It was a symbol of sophistication and status and connection to something larger than your immediate village. By the late medieval period, you also had the development of fortified wines and distilled spirits made from wine, which we'll get into more deeply when we talk about distillation. But the point here is that wine created a framework in medieval society, where consciousness alterati. On was not just accepted but celebrated as long as you had the money to afford it. Wine was woven through medicine, religion, culture, and social life in a way that was essentially inescapable for anyone with wealth and status. And that created an interesting dynamic. Different classes of people had access to different forms of consciousness alteration. The peasant had beer, regular, constant, low-level intoxication from drinking it all day. The slightly wealthier person had access to stronger drinks like cider or mead occasionally. The wealthy person had access to wine, and specifically wine, that could be mixed with other things. The very wealthy person had access to rare wines and exotic medicines mixed with wine and spices that might cost more than most people made in a year. And all of this was completely normal and expected. Wine also created a vocabulary for consciousness alteration that separated it from simple drunkenness. When you talked about wine, you could talk about flavor, about quality, about origin, about the year it was made, about what it was mixed with, about the effects it produced, in very specific language. You could be a wine connoisseur, which meant you spent significant time and money on consciousness alteration through wine. But you weren't a drunkard. You were a person of refined taste. This vocabulary and framing made it possible for medieval people to engage in sophisticated consciousness alteration while maintaining their social status and their dignity, at least as long as they were wealthy enough to afford it. Historians still argue about how drunk medieval people actually got on average, and how much of their daily consciousness was altered by the steady consumption of low-alcohol beverages. But the evidence suggests that most medieval people had some level of alcohol in their system most of the time, and that this was just accepted as no. Rommel and among the wealthy, there was deliberate consciousness alteration happening through wine and wine-based medicines in ways that were much more intentional and sophisticated than we often recognize. What you're looking at is a society where consciousness alteration through fermented beverages was so woven into the culture that it was basically invisible. But it was there in the beer that everyone drank, in the wine that marked special occasions and wealth, in the wine-based medicines that the wealthy consumed, in the rituals and ceremonies and social structures that all revolved around drinking something that altered your consciousness. But fermented grain and fermented grain weren't the only fermented grapes, weren't the only fermented thing that medieval people had figured out. Honey was precious. It was the only way to make sweet things, since sugarcane was exotic and expensive and barely imported into Europe. Honey was valuable enough that it was often used as currency. Honey was worth stealing. Honey was worth protecting. And bees, which made honey, were valuable enough that killing someone's bees could be a serious crime. So when someone figured out that you could ferment honey and make something called mead, something that was intoxicating and that didn't go bad the way wine did, this was genuinely significant. Mead was a way to use honey, something expensive and valuable, to create a beverage that would last longer than wine, that you could actually age and store, that would become stronger over time instead of weaker. Mead was alchemy. Mead was taking something precious and turning it into something precious in a different way. And mead had a special status in medieval culture. It was expensive, so it was wealthy people's drink, but not quite as expensive as wine necessarily. It was associated with ancient culture. Mead had been around for thousands of years, and it carried that way. Tea of history. It was associated with the Nordic Germanic cultures, which had their own prestige and interest for medieval Europeans. Mead was something that was special. If you were serving mead at an event, you were indicating that this was important. What's really interesting about mead is that it was incredibly easy to manipulate. You could ferment honey straight and get pure mead, but you could also ferment honey and add herbs, creating what was called metheglin. You could add ginger or clove or nutmeg or any of the other expensive spices that were becoming available through trade. You could create different varieties of mead that had different properties. You could create mead that was supposedly medicinal, that was meant to help with specific conditions. You could create mead that was meant to be especially intoxicating, or especially mild. Mead became a platform for experimentation in the same way that wine did. But mead was also its own thing, more stable, more beautiful when it was clear, longer lasting, and accessible to a broader range of wealthy people. The fermentation of honey also leads us to something slightly different. The fermentation of other sweet things. Fermented fruit was everywhere in medieval Europe. Berries fermented into something intoxicating. Apples became cider, which was huge in regions where apples grew, but grapes didn't. Pears became perry. Any fruit that had enough sugar could be fermented, and medieval people did fermented just about everything. Cider, in particular, was so common in some regions that it was as basic as beer, and some people drank it constantly throughout the day. What's fascinating about cider is that it's less socially marked than wine or mead, but more consciousness-altering than beer. You could be a peasant or a farmer drinking cider all day, and it was just a normal beverage, but you were getting more intoxicated from it than someone drinking beer would be. In regions where apples grew well and grapes didn't, cider filled the role that wine played in wine regions. It was the platform for everything else. It was what you drank. It was what you worked through. It was what marked occasions. By the late medieval period, every region had its own fermented beverages, and all of them involved consciousness alteration. Some regions had strong traditions of beer brewing, some had wine, some had cider, some had mead, some had multiple traditions overlapping. A wealthy medieval person in a wine region might have access to all of these. Beer as the everyday drink, wine as the prestigious drink, mead as the special occasion drink, cider as the harvest drink, and stronger varieties of all of them for specific purposes. What's important to understand is that these weren't luxuries or pleasures or vices that were separate from regular life. These were basic parts of how medieval society functioned. The calories from fermented beverages were significant. The hydration was significant. The fact that fermentation made things safe to drink was significant, and the consciousness alteration that came along with it was just part of the deal. It wasn't a separate thing that people were doing for kicks, although they were partly doing it for that, too. It was woven into survival, into culture, into religion, into medicine, into everything. Also worth noting, medieval people had figured out through long experience that different fermented beverages had slightly different effects. Beer had a heaviness to it, made you feel solid. Wine was sometimes described as more heating, or creating a different kind of intoxication than beer. Mead was smoother, less harsh. Cider was crisp and different from all of them. This is partly physiological. Different beverages do hit different receptors and create slightly different experiences, but it's also cultural interpretation. People expected fermented beverages to affect them in certain ways, and that expectation shaped the actual experience. One other thing that's really important, by the medieval period, people had been fermenting things for literally thousands of years. They had accumulated incredible knowledge about how to do it, how to control it, how to make it consistent, how to age it, how to store it. The medieval brewer or vintner was the inheritor of an incredibly long tradition of practical chemistry. They were doing sophisticated work. They were understanding fermentation on an intuitive, practical level that was deeply sophisticated, even if they couldn't explain the chemistry. They understood temperature. They understood time. They understood how to prevent contamination. They understood how different ingredients changed the process. This wasn't crude or simple. This was expert-level work. So the picture you're building up is this. Medieval Europe was a society built partially on fermented beverages. These beverages were everywhere. They ranged in strength and character depending on region and season and wealth. They all involved some level of consciousness alteration. They were all completely normal and integrated into every level of society. And underlying all of it was an incredibly sophisticated understanding of fermentation that had been accumulated across thousands of years. And that was just with fermented beverages. That was using natural processes to convert carbohydrates into alcohol and letting that be the main consciousness-altering substance. But medieval people didn't stop there. They figured out how to concentrate those beverages. They figured out how to add other things to them. And then they figured out how to use plants and fungi and other substances to create consciousness alteration in completely different ways. The fermentation was just the foundation. Everything else built on top of that. Now, let's talk about beer specifically, because beer deserves its own section. Beer was the foundation of medieval European civilization in a way that's genuinely hard to overstate. If you're trying to understand medieval consciousness alteration, you have to understand beer, because beer was what most medieval people drank most of the time. And beer was the technology that made it possible to have settlements larger than a certain size. Here's why. Water in medieval Europe was dangerous. It was contaminated with pathogens that could kill you. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, all of these were waterborne and you got them from drinking water. But beer required boiling water as part of the brewing process, which killed pathogens. Then you added hops or other herbs to preserve it, which helped prevent contamination. Then you fermented it, which created alcohol, which is itself antimicrobial. So beer was safe. Beer didn't kill you, water did. Therefore, beer was the default beverage. But here's the thing, beer had alcohol in it. First, beer's the thing. Beer had alcohol in it. Not huge amounts. Medieval beer was often weaker than modern beer. Maybe 3 to 5% alcohol, but it was there. And if you drank beer all day, which many medieval people did, you were consuming a certain amount of alcohol all day. The effect was usually not dramatic. You weren't necessarily getting drunk, but you were never completely sober either. Your baseline consciousness was slightly altered from what it would be if you drank only water. The production of beer was also incredibly important to medieval society. Monasteries, as we mentioned, were major centers of beer production, but there were also professional brewers, people whose job it was to make beer. In many medieval towns, brewing was regulated. You had to have a license to brew. You had to meet certain standards. You had to pay taxes on what you brewed. This was a major source of revenue for municipalities. Brewing was infrastructure. What's fascinating is how consistent medieval brewers were able to make beer over time. The techniques were passed down, carefully guarded, sometimes improved. Different regions developed different styles of beer. Some beer was meant to be drunk fresh. Some was meant to be aged. Some was stronger, especially strong ale or double beer, which was brewed to be more intoxicating and was often more expensive. Some was weaker, small beer, which had very low alcohol content and was what you gave to children and the elderly and people who you wanted to stay relatively sober. Medieval beer also usually had herbs in it, and the specific herbs varied. Before hops became standardized as the main preservative and flavoring herb, which happened gradually through the medieval period with hops becoming more common, especially in Northern Europe. Beer was made with all sorts of herbs and plants. You had gruit, which was a mixture of herbs including things like mugwort, heather, and marsh myrtle. These herbs had preservative properties, but some of them also had consciousness-altering properties of their own. Mugwort, for instance, can produce unusual dreams and has psychoactive properties. Medieval beer, with gruit, wasn't just creating consciousness alteration through alcohol. It was potentially creating consciousness alteration through multiple substances at once. By the later medieval period, hops were becoming more common, at least in Northern Europe. Hops are also psychoactive to some extent. They have sedative properties, but they're much milder than gruit herbs. So as hops replaced gruit, beer became in some ways less consciousness-altering and in other ways just differently consciousness-altering. The shift to hops also made beer taste different and made it preserve longer, which changed the entire medieval beer culture and economy. The social life around beer was also really important. You didn't just drink beer at home. You drank it in taverns and alehouses. These were social spaces. This was where communities formed. This is where you heard gossip, made deals, socialized, felt like you belonged to something. The tavern was a crucial institution in medieval life, and alcohol was the social lubricant that made the tavern function. Getting drunk at the tavern was a way of participating in community. It was a way of bonding with other people. It was social and cultural, not just chemical. There were also rules around drinking. You were supposed to drink in moderation, at least in theory. The church disapproved of drunkenness, even while producing and distributing beer. There were ideas about who could drink what. Men could drink more than women, although women definitely drank too. Wealthy people might drink more expensive beer. Poor people drank cheap beer. There were regulations about beer prices to try to prevent exploitation. There were tavern regulations to try to prevent chaos and violence. Drinking was social and regulated and rule-bound, even though it was also universal. But there's also a darker side to medieval beer culture. Alcoholism was real. People got drunk and stayed drunk. People lost their livelihoods to drinking. People got violent when drunk. People made terrible decisions because of alcohol. The church had to keep preaching against the sin of drunkenness, which suggests that drunkenness was common enough to be a problem worth preaching about. Medieval society had substance abuse issues, and they were related to the fact that the primary safe beverage also had consciousness-altering properties and was socially encouraged. What's fascinating is that medieval people understood this. They understood that beer could be abused. They had concepts of drunkenness and excess. They had moral frameworks for thinking about drinking. They had rules and regulations designed to prevent problems. They were trying to manage something that they recognized as a substance with both benefits and dangers. They couldn't succeed completely. Consciousness-altering substances that are socially necessary and widely available are inherently prone to abuse. But they tried. They had structures to try to prevent the worst outcomes. The technology of brewing itself was also constantly evolving. It shows that constantly evolving through the medieval period. People were trying to make better beer, more consistent beer, more intoxicating beer, less intoxicating beer, depending on what was needed. They were experimenting with different grains. They were experimenting with different herbs and preservation techniques. They were documenting their practices, at least in some cases. Monastic brewers would sometimes write out instructions so that their techniques would continue after they died. This was chemistry and technology and medicine all mixed together, and it was being done carefully and systematically. One more important thing. Beer was gendered in some ways. Men brewed beer professionally, but women also brewed beer, especially in smaller operations and home brewing. In fact, women were often the brewers in a household. The famous alewife was often a woman who brewed ale and sold it. So while professional brewing became increasingly male-dominated as it became a regulated trade, beer production was never purely masculine. Women had significant roles in beer production and distribution, which gave them economic power and access to consciousness-altering substances in ways that was sometimes respected and sometimes condemned. Historians still debate exactly how intoxicated medieval people were on average, and how much the constant consumption of low-alcohol beer affected medieval consciousness and behavior. Some scholars argue that everyone was continuously mildly intoxicated from beer, which would have had social and cognitive effects. Others argue that medieval people were used to it, and it had less effect than it would on modern people, or that the low alcohol content meant that continuous consumption didn't create continuous intoxication. But everyone agrees that beer was foundational, that it was involved in consciousness alteration, and that understanding medieval society requires understanding beer. Okay, now things get weird. We've been talking about fermented beverages, which altered consciousness through alcohol, which is a psychoactive substance, but one that's legal and socially acceptable in modern times, so it doesn't feel that weird. But medieval people also had access to plants that were far more consciousness-altering than alcohol, and they knew it. Poppy seeds, the tiny little things you see on bagels. Those came from the poppy plant, and that plant produces opium. Medieval people knew this. They used it. They ate poppy seeds. They made poppies into medicine. They got high on poppy products. Let's be clear about what we're talking about here. Opium contains morphine and codeine, and other opioid alkaloids. These are powerful consciousness-altering substances. They reduce pain. They create euphoria. They're addictive. And they can kill you if you take too much. Medieval people didn't have the chemistry to understand this in precise terms, but they had the practical knowledge. They knew that poppy worked for pain. They knew that you could take too much and die. They knew that some people got addicted to it. They knew that it was powerful. Poppies grew in medieval Europe. They grew wild in some places. They were cultivated in monastery gardens and in the gardens of wealthy people. You could make poppy seed oil by pressing the seeds. You could make it into a paste or a salve. You could make it into a syrup. You could make it into a syrup. You could eat the seeds raw. You could make it tea. There were multiple ways to consume it, which meant there were multiple ways to control dosage and effects. Poppy was in the medieval medical literature. It was recommended for pain. It was recommended for pain. It was recommended for insomnia. It was recommended for diarrhea. It was in the pharmacopoeias and the herbals that physicians and apothecaries consulted. So if you were wealthy enough to see a physician, you might get prescribed poppy for various ailments. If you were a woman who knew about plants and healing, poppy would be in your toolkit. If you were a monk who had access to herbs, you would have access to poppy. What's interesting is that poppy wasn't hidden or shameful. It was openly used and recommended. Medieval people weren't trying to hide the fact that they were using it. They were using it as medicine, which was perfectly legitimate. And if the medicine happened to make you feel good, well, that was a benefit, not something to be ashamed of. You were sick, and someone gave you poppy to help you get better. The fact that it altered your consciousness was secondary to the fact that it helped with pain. But here's where it gets interesting. Poppy also became fashionable among the wealthy, as something to take for reasons that weren't quite medical. If you had money, you could get poppy prepared in pleasant ways, in wine, in oil, maybe mixed with other things. You could take it for the feeling it gave you. You could take it recreationally as long as you framed it as healthcare. I'm feeling melancholy, so I'm taking poppy to improve my mood. Sounds completely reasonable. And it is in a way. Opium does improve mood, at least temporarily. But it's also consciousness alteration for pleasure, which is what we'd call recreational drug use. Poppy also created addiction, and medieval people understood this. You were supposed to use poppy for acute pain or specific problems, not continuously. If you kept taking it, you'd develop a need for it and start experiencing withdrawal if you stopped. Medieval physicians knew this. The herbals warned about it, but people still did it. People still got addicted to poppy products. And once you were addicted, you needed more of it, which was expensive if you weren't wealthy or didn't have access to medical care. What's really important to understand is that medieval consciousness alteration through poppy wasn't just medical. It overlapped medicine and recreation and self-medication and addiction in ways that are genuinely indistinguishable from modern drug use. The only difference was that it was happening under the aegis of medicine and healthcare, which made it socially acceptable and protected people from legal consequences. But the actual behavior, people using consciousness, altering substances, becoming dependent on them, seeking them out for the way they made them feel, was fundamentally the same as modern drug use. Also worth noting, there were other plants with opioid alkaloids available in medieval Europe. There was the breadseed poppy, which is what most medieval cultivation focused on. But there was also the opium poppy, which contains much higher concentrations of alkaloids, and was used in the Islamic world and in the Mediterranean regions, where it could be traded. So medieval people had access to a range of poppy products with varying strengths. By the late medieval period, there's also evidence of opium coming from further east through trade routes. Opium from the Ottoman Empire and from India and from other places started becoming available in Europe, especially in Venice and other trading cities. This was raw opium, which was much stronger than poppy seeds and much more powerful. This was a genuinely serious drug, and people were using it, and it was available through merchants and apothecaries. One of the things that's really significant about the availability of poppy products is that it shows that medieval people weren't making a clear distinction between plant-derived substances that are now legal, like opium, which comes from the same plant that poppy seeds come from, and plant-derived substances that are now illegal, like heroin, which is processed opium. They had the plant. They extracted what they could from it. They used it for medical purposes and for consciousness alteration, and they dealt with the consequences. They were engaging in what would now be called serious drug use, using one of the same plants that modern pharmaceutical companies use to manufacture prescription painkillers. Historians still argue about how widespread poppy use was in medieval Europe, whether it was a common thing that most people had access to, or whether it was relatively rare and limited to the wealthy and people with medical connections. The evidence suggests it was somewhere in the middle. It wasn't like everyone was using it constantly, but it wasn't rare either. You could get it if you knew where to look, and especially if you had money or connections. And in regions where poppies grew well or where they were cultivated, it was probably more common. But the key point is that medieval people had access to opium, which is one of the most powerful consciousness-altering substances known. They used it. They knew it was powerful. They knew it could be dangerous. And they integrated it into their society in ways that allowed it to be used both medically and recreationally, without much social stigma attached to the recreational use as long as you had the resources to afford it. Now we move to something that genuinely freaked medieval people out while also fascinating them. The mandrake root. The mandrake plant is real. It exists, and it's a plant that grows in Mediterranean and Middle Eastern regions, and it's spread to Europe, where it was cultivated in gardens. The mandrake root is distinctive because it's often forked, and if you use your imagination, and medieval people absolutely used their imagination, it looks vaguely human. It looks like a tiny human, complete with arms and legs. Medieval people believed that the mandrake root was actually humanoid. They believed that it was a magical plant with human characteristics. They believed that when you pulled it out of the ground, it screamed, and if you heard the scream, you would die. Therefore, there were elaborate rituals for harvesting mandrake. You would tie a dog to the plant and get the dog to pull it out so you wouldn't be the one hearing the fatal scream, or you would plug your ears, or you would do specific rituals at specific times of the day or night. The mandrake was wrapped in mystery and magic. What medieval people didn't necessarily know, at least not in scientific terms, was that mandrake roots contained tropane alkaloids, scopolamine, hyoscyamin, and atropine. These are powerful consciousness-altering substances. They produce hallucinations, delirium, confusion, and a sense that your body isn't your own. They're dangerous, and they're also genuinely disorienting. So, when medieval people used mandrake, they weren't just getting a mild consciousness alteration. They were having a seriously strange experience. Mandrake was used in medieval medicine, and it was also used for consciousness alteration. You could make it into a paste, a drink, or you could, in some accounts, literally just hold the root and absorb its properties, although whether that actually worked or was just placebo is debatable. You could also supposedly just smell it or touch it and have effects, which again might be partly placebo, but might also be partly because the alkaloids could be absorbed through skin and mucous membranes. What's fascinating is that some of the mandrake preparations involve mixing it with other things. You might mix it with wine or beer to make it taste better and help with absorption. You might mix it with other medicinal herbs. You might make it into a salve that was rubbed on skin. There were different methods, different traditions, different ways of using it, depending on what effect you wanted. The experiences people had with mandrake were genuinely strange. The alkaloids in mandrake can produce what's called delirium, a state where you're confused, where you're hallucinating, where you don't know what's real. You might feel like you're flying, or like demons are attacking you, or like you're someone else entirely. It's not like a mild consciousness alteration. It's genuinely disorienting and can be scary. Medieval people reported these experiences, and they attributed them to magic, to witchcraft, to supernatural forces. But what was actually happening was a powerful pharmacological effect of the alkaloids. There's also the question of dosage, which is important when we're talking about plants with alkaloids that can kill you. Mandrake is toxic. If you take too much, you can die. You can also have really bad reactions, seizures, heart problems, serious psychological distress. So using mandrake was genuinely risky. You needed to know what you were doing. You needed to have the experience or the knowledge to not kill yourself. But medieval people did it because the consciousness alteration was interesting, or because they thought it was medicine, or because they were desperate, or because they wanted the experience. What's important to understand is that mandrake wasn't something that was widely available or widely used. It was specialized. If you were using mandrake, you probably had specific knowledge or connections. You probably knew someone who knew how to prepare it. You probably had some idea of what you were getting into. So, mandrake consciousness alteration was probably limited to relatively specific groups of people. Monks and herbalists, and wealthy people who could access rare and expensive materials. But it was definitely happening. There are accounts of people using mandrake. There are recipes for mandrake preparations. There are warnings about the dangers. There are stories of people having strange experiences after using mandrake. Medieval culture knew about mandrake and knew that it did something powerful to consciousness. The mythology around mandrake was also part of the experience. The belief that it was magical, that it screamed when pulled from the ground, that it was essentially a tiny human with magical properties. This belief shaped how people interpreted their experiences with it. If you took mandrake and had a weird vision, you might attribute it to the magic of the plant rather than to chemistry. You might think you'd made contact with a spirit. You might think you'd been cursed or blessed. The cultural framework shaped the interpretation of the neurochemical experience. There's also evidence that mandrake was used in ointments that were rubbed on skin. And there's a whole complex of ideas around flying ointment and witch's brew that involved mandrake and other plants. We'll get into that more when we talk about nightshade and other flying ointment ingredients. But the point here is that mandrake was part of a complex of consciousness-altering practices that involved multiple substances, multiple methods of administration, and multiple cultural frameworks for understanding what was happening. One more thing. Mandrake had gender associations. The root was called the male mandrake or the female mandrake, depending on its shape. There were ideas about potency and power related to these gender categories. There was magic involved, and magic had gendered dimensions. The women who knew about mandrake, who grew it, who prepared it, who used it, these were often people who were connected to witchcraft accusations. Again, we're seeing a pattern where the people who knew the most about consciousness-altering substances, who had the knowledge to use them effectively and safely, were often the people who were targeted for witch hunts. Historians still debate how much mandrake was actually used in medieval Europe versus how much of it is folklore and legend. Some scholars think it was fairly rare and specialized. Others think it was more common than we realize. But everyone agrees it was being used, and everyone agrees that people understood it, had powerful consciousness-altering properties. What you're looking at is another layer of medieval consciousness alteration. Not just fermented beverages with alcohol, not just poppy with opioids, but powerful hallucinogenic plants with tropane alkaloids. And this pattern is going to continue. Medieval people had access to more consciousness-altering substances than you might expect, and they were using them in various ways under various frameworks with varying levels of understanding and safety. Now things get even more intense. If mandrake is weird, henbane is weirder, and it was probably more common. Henbane is a plant that grows wild in parts of Europe, and it contains scopolamine and hyoscyamine and other tropane alkaloids, the same class of chemicals that mandrake has, but with a different profile. And unlike mandrake, which is somewhat rare, henbane is actually pretty easy to grow. You can cultivate it. It spreads readily. It's not hard to find. What makes henbane particularly interesting is that it's genuinely hallucinogenic. If you take it, you will hallucinate. You will see things that aren't there. You will hear things that aren't there. You will feel things that aren't there. You might feel like your body is changing shape. You might feel like you're dissolving. You might feel like you're flying. The experience is profound and disorienting, and it lasts for hours, and it's not particularly pleasant. Most accounts of henbane use describe panic, fear, confusion, and a sense that something is fundamentally wrong with reality. Medieval people used henbane despite these terrible experiences. They used it because they thought it was medicine. They used it because they thought it connected them to the spiritual world. They used it for entertainment in the way that some people seek out scary experiences. They used it because they didn't understand how dangerous it was. They used it because they were desperate. And when they used it, they had experiences that they couldn't explain, that terrified them, that changed how they understood reality. What's particularly significant about henbane is that it was available to common people. It wasn't exotic like mandrake. It wasn't expensive like rare spices. It was a plant that grew wild or could be cultivated easily. If you lived in rural Europe and you knew what henbane looked like, you could find it. If you wanted to experiment with it, you could. This meant that henbane consciousness alteration was probably more common than mandrake consciousness alteration. Even though henbane's effects are generally more negative and more terrifying, the alkaloids in henbane cause a particular kind of delirium. You lose your sense of time. You lose your sense of your body's boundaries. You experience what's called anticholinergic intoxication, a state where your body feels wrong, where you can't focus, where you're confused and anxious. You might feel like you can't move or like you're moving in strange ways. You might feel like you're not in your own body. You might feel like you're dying. And all of this is happening while you're hallucinating. So you have visual and sensory experiences that confirm that something is seriously wrong. When medieval people had these experiences, what did they interpret them as? Witchcraft, possession, demons, supernatural attack, curses. These were the frameworks available to them. The terror and confusion that henbane produces. These could easily be interpreted as evidence of spiritual or supernatural attack. And if you recovered from the experience, you might interpret it as having been touched by witchcraft or demonology. If the person who gave you the henbane was a woman, or someone marginalized, or someone with knowledge that seemed strange, suddenly there was a plausible explanation for the terror you'd experienced. Witchcraft. This is genuinely important for understanding medieval witch hunts. Some percentage of the people who were accused of witchcraft and executed were probably people who had intentionally or unintentionally exposed someone to henbane or other hallucinogenic plants. Someone had a terrifying experience, couldn't explain it, and blamed it on a witch. The woman who knew about plants, who maybe grew henbane for medical purposes, who maybe even gave it to someone thinking it would help with something, suddenly became the explanation for inexplicable terror. Henbane was also used in beer sometimes before hops became the standard. Groot, the herb mixture used before hops, might contain henbane along with other herbs. So you might have drunk beer that contained henbane without knowing it. The effects would be milder than taking pure henbane, but they would be present. You might drink a drink that's supposed to be beer and discover that it does something weird to your consciousness. And you might blame it on magic or witchcraft or demonic influence. There were also preparations of henbane for medical use. It was supposed to help with pain, with insomnia, with various ailments. And because of the consciousness-altering effects, it probably did help with some things. If you're in pain and henbane makes you dissociate, then technically your pain is less, even though you're having a terrifying experience. But medieval physicians didn't have the language to make that distinction. They just knew that henbane was powerful medicine. What's also interesting is that henbane has varying potency, depending on where it grows and what time of year you harvest it. Different parts of the plant have different concentrations of alkaloids, so the same preparation made at different times, or from different sources, might have different strengths. This created unpredictability. You might take something that's supposed to be a mild medicine and have an overwhelming hallucinogenic experience. Or you might take something that's supposed to be powerful and have a mild effect. The lack of standardization and the lack of understandardization and the lack of understanding of what was creating the effects meant that henbane use was genuinely risky. Medieval people understood that henbane was dangerous. They warned about it. They recommended caution, but they also continued to use it because it was available, because they thought it was medicine, because they didn't have alternatives for the conditions it might help with. So, they risked it. They experimented with it. They sometimes had genuinely traumatic experiences as a result. One more important thing, henbane's effects depend on the dose and the sensitivity of the individual. Some people might take a small amount and have a manageable experience. Some people might take a small amount and have a completely overwhelming experience. Women seem to be affected at lower doses than men, which might be related to body weight and metabolism. So there were gender differences in how people experienced henbane, which would have affected the narratives around it, and the types of experiences people had. Historians still argue about how much henbane was actually deliberately used versus how much it was accidental contamination or misidentified plants, but the evidence suggests it was definitely being used. Definitely, deliberately, by some people, and definitely causing experiences that were significant enough to be remembered and recorded and interpreted through medieval cultural frameworks. What you're building up now is a picture of medieval consciousness alteration that includes not just alcohol but also powerful hallucinogenic plants. And these plants don't create pleasant experiences. They create confusing, terrifying, disorienting experiences that people can't explain and will. They can't explain them. They blame witchcraft. And when they blame witchcraft, they look for someone to blame. And that someone is often a woman, or someone with knowledge, or someone marginalized. The consciousness-altering substances are in some ways complicit in the witch hunts because they create experiences that people interpret as evidence of witchcraft. And while we're talking about nightshade plants, because henbane is a nightshade, as is mandrake, we need to talk about deadly nightshade, also called belladonna. Belladonna means beautiful woman in Italian, and it got that name because medieval and Renaissance women would use it to make their pupils dilate. Dilated pupils were considered attractive. They made your eyes look bigger, more open, more vulnerable. So women would put belladonna in their eyes to make themselves more beautiful, which means they were deliberately poisoning themselves with one of the most toxic plants in Europe in order to look good. Belladonna, like mandrake and henbane, contains tropane alkaloids, but the concentration is particularly high. And unlike henbane, which you might accidentally encounter, belladonna was deliberately cultivated. It was grown in gardens. It was prepared for use. It was used deliberately by women who knew what they were doing. And yes, it made your pupils dilate. And yes, it also made you confused, anxious, disoriented, paranoid, and at risk of serious toxicity. But the cosmetic effect was worth it, at least to some women. Belladonna also had medicinal uses. It was used for pain. It was used for various ailments. Like all the other consciousness-altering plants, it existed in a space where medicine and recreation and beauty and danger all overlapped. You put it in your eyes to be beautiful, and you also got the consciousness-altering effects. You took it as medicine for pain, and you also got the disorienting effects. The boundaries between categories didn't exist. It was all one thing. What's particularly interesting about belladonna is that it's one of the most dangerous plants in Europe. It's extremely toxic. If you take too much, you will die. If you put it in your eyes and absorb too much, you can die. The margin between a dose that produces the desired effect and a dose that's fatal is relatively small. Medieval women who were using belladonna to dilate their pupils were taking a genuine risk. Some of them probably died. Some of them probably had serious side effects. But the social pressure to be beautiful was strong enough that they did it anyway. This is also relevant to the witch trials because witches, or people accused of being witches, were sometimes accused of using belladonna ointment. The idea was that witches would create a salve using belladonna and other ingredients, and they would rub it on their body, and it would allow them to fly to Sabbaths, midnight meetings of witches. The disorienting effects of belladonna could easily be interpreted as part of magical transportation. If you rub belladonna on your body and it gets absorbed through your skin, you will feel strange. You will feel like your body is changing. You will hallucinate. You will feel like you're flying or like you're in a different place. If you go to sleep while experiencing these effects, you might have dreams about flying or traveling. When you wake up, you might interpret the experience as having actually happened. So the flying ointment that witches supposedly used might have been real. Might have been women using preparations of nightshade plants to create consciousness, altering experiences that they then interpreted as magical transportation. And when they were accused of witchcraft, when they were interrogated, they might have confessed to using these ointments because, well, they had used them. And they might interpret their experiences as witchcraft too. This is a fascinating and horrible intersection of chemistry, culture, and justice. Medieval women were using belladonna to be beautiful and to have interesting experiences and to self-medicate and to engage in consciousness alteration. They were having real, powerful experiences that felt magical. And then they were arrested, tortured, and executed based on the assumption that these experiences were evidence of witchcraft. The consciousness-altering substances are not separate from the witch hunts. They're central to understanding what was happening. Belladonna also connects to another important thing, the idea of witches' flight. If you create a reasonable hypothesis about how witches were supposedly flying, if you start with the idea that they were using substances that would make them feel like they were flying, that would create hallucinations of traveling, that would make time feel distorted, then you can explain a lot of witch trial testimony. Not all of it, because some accusations were clearly false and malicious. But some of it makes sense if you understand that the accused witches might actually have been using consciousness-altering substances and having experiences that felt magical to them. The other thing about belladonna is that knowledge of it was gendered. Women were more likely to know about it because it was used for beauty. Women were using it. Women were massing that knowledge to other women, and women with knowledge of dangerous plants, knowledge that could hurt people, but also knowledge that could hurt people, but also knowledge that could help people. These women were eventually the targets of witch hunts. So the consciousness-altering plants are also connected to gender and to the ways that women's knowledge was both valued and dangerous. There's also the question of whether belladonna's consciousness-altering effects were understood and deliberately sought, or whether they were just side effects. Probably both. Some women using belladonna to dilate their pupils would be aware that it had consciousness-altering effects and might seek those out. Some would experience them as strange side effects. But the knowledge that belladonna did something to consciousness, that it could produce hallucinations, that it could create experiences that felt magical, this knowledge would have spread among women who used it. Historians still argue about how widespread belladonna use was and how deliberately it was used for consciousness alteration versus just for the cosmetic effect. But there's evidence that it was known, that it was available, that some people used it deliberately for the consciousness-altering effects, and that the experiences it created, the hallucinations, the sense of flying or traveling, the disorientation, were significant enough that they became woven into witch trial narratives. What's emerging here is a fuller picture of medieval consciousness alteration. It wasn't just fermented beverages. It was a sophisticated multi-substance approach to altering consciousness that involved plants with different properties, different methods of administration, different risks and benefits of administration, different risks and benefits. And it was happening alongside a cultural framework that interpreted these experiences as witchcraft, that associated consciousness alteration with magic and demonic forces, and that targeted the people who knew the most about consciousness-altering substances. Now we need to talk about something that might have affected entire medieval communities at once: ergot. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye grain, particularly in wet years. If you harvest rye grain that's infected with ergot, and you mill it into flour and you bake it into bread, and you eat it, you will consume ergot alkaloids, which include lysergic acid compounds, which are essentially a natural form of LSD. This is not a small thing. This is a consciousness-altering compound that's comparable in its effects to the most powerful hallucinogens. If you eat bread made from ergot-infected grain, you will hallucinate. You will have profound dissociative experiences. You might have seizures. Your hands and feet might feel like they're burning or dying. You might become paranoid. You might become violent. You might see demons or angels. You might think you're dying. And here's the terrifying part. You don't know why. You've eaten bread. You've gone about your day. And suddenly something is very, very wrong. Your body feels strange. Your mind is broken. You're hallucinating. You can't explain it. The bread looks fine. Nobody warned you. And if this is happening to multiple people in your village at the same time, which it would be since you're all eating bread from the same grain supply. Then suddenly your whole village is experiencing something inexplicable. This was actually documented. There are historical accounts of dancing plagues and mass madness in medieval Europe. There are accounts of people having convulsions, seeing visions, experiencing terror, becoming violent. These were sometimes attributed to witchcraft, to divine punishment, to demonic possession. But at least some of them were probably ergot poisoning. Entire villages were being poisoned by their own food, and they didn't know why. What makes ergot even more terrible is that you can't necessarily see it. The ergot fungus creates dark, hard growth called sclerotia on the grain heads. And if you look carefully, you can see them. But if you're milling grain, if you're processing it in large quantities, you might not notice. The medieval grain processing wasn't hygienic or thorough. People were eating ergot all the time in small quantities. In wet years, they were eating it in larger quantities. The symptoms of ergot poisoning are called ergotism or St. Anthony's fire. The burning sensation in your hands and feet can be so intense that people thought their limbs were actually on fire. Some people developed gangrene from the blood vessel constriction that ergot causes. They'd lose fingers or toes or entire limbs. They'd go to a saint's shrine and pray, and sometimes the symptoms would go away because the ergot concentration in the food supply had decreased. And then they'd attribute it to saintly intervention, not realizing that the cause was fungal contamination of grain. What's particularly important to understand is that ergotism could mimic other conditions. The hallucinations could look like demonic possession or witchcraft. The paranoia could look like a reasonable response to a bewitched world. The convulsions could look like signs of supernatural affliction. So when a whole village was dealing with ergot poisoning, they would interpret it through their cultural frameworks. And those frameworks involved witches, demons, divine punishment, saints, and supernatural forces. And here's where it gets really interesting in terms of witch trials. Some of the famous witch trial cases might actually have involved ergot poisoning. The initial afflictions that led to witch hunts, the hallucinations, the sense that something supernatural was happening. These could have been ergot poisoning. And then when people started accusing witches, they were actually looking for an explanation for a food poisoning that nobody understood. This doesn't explain all witch trials, and it's not a complete explanation for any of them, but it's part of the picture. Medieval people were being poisoned by consciousness-altering fungi in their grain supply. They were experiencing profound consciousness alteration that T.A. couldn't explain. They were interpreting it through their cultural frameworks, and then they were blaming witches, and then they were executing people. Medieval people understood that grain could go bad. They had concepts of contamination and disease, but they didn't understand fungal poisoning. They didn't understand ergot. They understood that some grain made you sick, that some harvests were worse than others, that wet years seemed to have more problems, but they couldn't connect the dots to the fungal contamination that was causing it. By the late medieval period, there might have been some knowledge that grain could be the source of the problem. There are some accounts of people discussing the danger of ergot-contaminated grain, but the knowledge wasn't systematic or widespread. And even if people knew that grain could be the problem, they couldn't necessarily avoid it. If that was the grain you had, that was what you ate. There was no alternative. The other thing about ergot is that the hallucinogenic compounds have a dose-response curve. Small amounts cause mild effects. Large amounts cause severe effects. The amount of ergot in grain varied depending on the weather and the conditions, so the severity of symptoms would vary. This unpredictability would add to the sense that something supernatural was happening. Sometimes people would be fine. Sometimes they'd be severely affected and there was no clear pattern. Historians still debate how much of medieval mass possession and witchcraft accusations can be attributed to ergot poisoning. Some scholars think it was a significant factor. Some think it was relatively minor. The evidence is circumstantial. We're looking at historical accounts of symptoms and trying to figure out if they match ergot poisoning, which is imprecise. But everyone agrees that ergot poisoning was happening, that it was causing profound consciousness alteration, and that it could plausibly have contributed to some of the cultural phenomena of witchcraft accusations and mass hysteria. What's particularly striking is that ergot consciousness alteration was happening to people without their knowledge or consent. They thought they were eating bread. They were actually consuming a powerful hallucinogenic fungus, and then they were experiencing consciousness alteration and had no explanation for it, and they blamed it on witches and demons and supernatural forces. Let's shift gears slightly and talk about hemp. Hemp is cannabis, and cannabis has psychoactive properties. It contains THC and CBD and other cannabinoids that affect consciousness. Medieval people in Europe didn't use hemp the way people in Central Asia or India did. But hemp was growing in medieval Europe, and medieval people knew it had properties. Hemp was primarily used for fiber. You could make rope from it, cloth from it, sails from it. Hemp was valuable for these practical purposes. But medieval people also knew that hemp had medicinal properties. It was recommended in herbals for pain, for inflammation, for various ailments. And if you prepared it in certain ways, if you used the flowering parts rather than just the stem, you could get the consciousness-altering effects of cannabis. What's important is that medieval Europe didn't have the same tradition of cannabis use for consciousness alteration that Central Asia or India did. This wasn't an established practice, but there's evidence that some people in medieval Europe did use cannabis for consciousness alteration, particularly in regions with more advanced medical knowledge, or among people who had contact with the Islamic world where cannabis use was more established. The evidence suggests that cannabis use in medieval Europe was relatively rare and probably limited to educated people, where, with knowledge of herbalism or medicine, or people who had connections to other cultures, where cannabis was more commonly used for intoxication. But it was definitely possible, and it was definitely happening to some extent. What's particularly interesting is that cannabis fits into the same pattern as poppy and nightshade plants. It's a plant with consciousness-altering properties that could be framed as medicine that was recommended in herbals. That some people probably used for consciousness alteration, while others used it for actual medical purposes, and where the distinction between the two was blurry. Hemp was also gendered in some ways. Women were involved in the processing of hemp fiber, spinning, weaving, making cloth. They might have been more likely to encounter the consciousness-altering properties of hemp through handling the plant. They would have known about the plant's properties, and they might have used that knowledge for their own purposes. The other thing about hemp is that it's a plant that can be used in many different ways. You can smoke the flowers. You can make them into tea. You can prepare oil from the seeds. You can make preparations with the whole plant. Different methods of preparation would create different effects. So medieval herbalists and healers who knew about hemp would also know different ways to use it for different purposes. What's worth noting is that medieval hemp consciousness alteration, to whatever extent it existed, didn't lead to the kind of panic or moral crusade that alcohol did in later periods. This was probably because it wasn't widespread enough to be noticeable. If most people were using cannabis regularly, there might have been legal restrictions and moral panic. But since it was rare and limited to specific groups, it didn't become a major social issue. Historians still argue about the extent of hemp cannabis use in medieval Europe and whether it should be considered part of the landscape of medieval consciousness alteration. Some scholars emphasize it heavily, others minimize it, but there's definitely evidence that it was possible, that some people did it, and that it was known to have consciousness-altering properties. One more thing, hemp fiber production might have exposed some medieval workers to enough THC and other cannabinoids that they experienced some consciousness alteration just from handling the plants. Women spinning hemp fiber, working with the plants, would have been exposed to the compounds. They might not have thought of it as consciousness alteration. It might have just felt like normal variation in how they felt on different days, but they might have experienced mild psychoactive effects from their work. What cannabis represents in the landscape of medieval consciousness alteration is another option, another plant that could be used if you knew how to use it. Another way to alter consciousness that existed, but wasn't as central to medieval society as fermented beverages or nightshade, plants, or poppy. Now let's talk about something that feels more innocent, but was actually quite central to medieval consciousness alteration: incense and frankincense. These are aromatic compounds that burn and produce fragrant smoke, and they're present in medieval religious and cultural practices. You're in a church and incense is burning. You're breathing in the smoke for hours. What are you experiencing? First, you're experiencing a lot of sensory stimulation. Incense smells good, or at least it smells interesting. It fills your senses. It connects to religious experience. You're in church. You're experiencing beauty and transcendence and holiness. And incense is part of that. But more importantly, you're breathing in compounds that have psychoactive properties. Different incense nesses contain different compounds. Frankincense contains boswellic acids and other compounds. Myrrh contains sesquiterpenes and other aromatic compounds. Some incenses contain plants with consciousness-altering properties. Incense that contains psychoactive plants would have obvious effects. But even incense that's just aromatic, that's not technically psychoactive, can affect consciousness through other mechanisms. First, there's the aster/relaxation aspect. Incense smells good, creates a sensory atmosphere that's calming and nice. And just that experience can shift consciousness. You feel more relaxed, more open, more receptive. That's not a chemical consciousness alteration in the strict sense, but it's a consciousness alteration nonetheless. Your mind is in a different state. Second, if you're breathing in incense smoke for hours in a church service, you're breathing in particulates. You're breathing in particulates. You're breathing in smoke. That smoke can have mild intoxicating effects. You might feel slightly lightheaded, slightly dizzy, slightly altered. Combined with the religious experience, the music, the ritual, the visual beauty of the church, this could create a significant consciousness alteration. Third, there's the expectation and framing. You're in church. You believe that incense is part of a sacred ritual. You believe that incense might connect you to the divine or help you experience transcendence. That belief, that expectation, will shape your experience. You might experience more consciousness alteration than the actual chemistry will explain, because you're expecting to feel something and your brain is predisposed to notice and amplify those experiences. What's particularly interesting is that incense was used in religious contexts, which meant it was legitimized. Using incense wasn't something shameful or secret. It was part of religious practice. So people could experience conscious. Eiste 13th century, Egypt illusness, alteration through incense, in public, in church, as part of their religious devotion. The consciousness alteration was literally baked into religious practice. Frankincense in particular was expensive and precious. It was one of the famous gifts the Magi brought to Jesus. It was valuable. It was rare. It was beautiful. So burning frankincense was also a statement of devotion and resources. You were literally burning money for the sake of religious experience. Medieval people understood that incense affected consciousness. They might not have had chemistry language for it, but they understood that incense made you feel different, that it was part of religious experience, that it could help you access spiritual states. Incense was therefore part of medieval consciousness alteration, woven through religious practice in a way that made it visible and legitimate. Some incenses also contained herbs or plants with mild psychoactive properties. If an incense contained mugwort or damiana or other plants, you'd be breathing in those compounds along with the fragrance. The effects would be mild, but they would be present, and you probably wouldn't even know that you were breathing in consciousness-altering compounds because you were just smelling the incense, enjoying the scent. The other thing about incense is that it creates an atmosphere. Multiple incenses burning in a church create a thick smoke. You're in a haze of fragrant smoke, unable to see clearly across the church. That sensory deprivation combined with the consciousness-altering effects of the smoke itself could create significant effects. You might feel disconnected from your body, from your surroundings. You might focus inwards. You might experience spiritual visions or feel touched by the divine. Medieval monks and priests would have been particularly affected by regular incense use. They were in churches for hours every day, breathing in incense smoke daily. Over time, that repeated exposure to mild consciousness alteration would become normal. They would expect to feel the effects of incense. They might interpret their experiences in religious terms. They might attribute their clarity of mind or their spiritual insights to divine grace or holy experience, when some of it might actually be the consciousness-altering effects of the incense. This is also relevant to questions about medieval religious experience. Were the visions that medieval saints had divine visitations? Or were they partly the result of consciousness alteration from incense, from fasting, from chanting, from sleep deprivation, from the many consciousness-altering practices that were part of medieval religious life? Probably some of both. Medieval religious experience was probably genuinely spiritual for those who experienced it, and it was also partly the result of various consciousness-altering practices and substances. Historians don't usually think of incense as a consciousness-altering substance when discussing medieval intoxication and drug use. It's not on the list of drugs that medieval people used, but it fits all the criteria. It alters consciousness. It has chemical effects on the brain. It was used deliberately and repeatedly. It was woven through culture and practice, and people experienced effects that they attributed to other causes, but which included consciousness alteration. What incense represents is a kind of hidden consciousness alteration, one that was so normalized and integrated into religious practice that it was invisible. Nobody was thinking of themselves as getting high on incense. They were thinking of themselves as participating in sacred ritual. But beneath that framing, consciousness alteration was happening. Now we need to talk about something completely unexpected. Nutmeg. You know nutmeg. It's the spice you put on eggnog or sprinkle on desserts. Medieval people knew about nutmeg, or at least wealthy medieval people did, because nutmeg was expensive. It came from the Banda Islands in what's now Indonesia, and it was one of the most valuable spices in medieval trade. You could buy a piece of property for the price of some nutmeg. It was absurdly expensive. But here's the thing. If you eat enough nutmeg, you get high. Not pleasantly high. Nutmeg intoxication is more like a bad high, with nausea, dizziness, hallucinations, dissociation, and a generally unpleasant experience. But it is definitely a consciousness-altering effect. Nutmeg contains myristicin and elemicin, which are psychoactive compounds that affect consciousness. Medieval people knew this, at least some of them. There are accounts in medieval herbals of nutmeg being used for consciousness alteration. It's not recommended because the experience is unpleasant and the side effects are severe, but it was known to do something. So wealthy medieval people who had access to nutmeg, and nutmeg was expensive enough that access was limited to the very wealthy, might have experimented with it. What's particularly interesting is that medieval nutmeg intoxication would have been rare. Most medieval people couldn't afford nutmeg, couldn't experiment with it, didn't have access to it. So if someone ate nutmeg deliberately to get high, they were someone wealthy, someone with resources, someone with access to rare luxury goods. And if they did it, they would have had an unpleasant experience and probably wouldn't do it again. But the existence of nutmeg consciousness alteration shows something important. Medieval people were willing to use whatever consciousness-altering substances were available, even expensive ones, even ones with bad side effects. The rarity and expensiveness of nutmeg, MPU, are actually more interesting to some people, not less. You're using something that's worth more than gold. That's a significant act. You're dedicating resources to consciousness alteration. There's also the question of whether medieval people used small amounts of nutmeg for mild consciousness altering effects rather than the larger amounts that would create obvious intoxication. A small amount of nutmeg added to wine or food might create subtle consciousness altering effects without being obvious. You might feel slightly different, more energized, more euphoric, more peaceful, without realizing it was the nutmeg. Medieval people might have done this deliberately or accidentally. Medieval cooks and apothecaries would have known that nutmeg had effects. They might have used it deliberately to create subtle consciousness alteration in foods they prepared for wealthy patrons. A medieval person eating a specially prepared meal that contained subtle amounts of nutmeg might experience mild consciousness alteration without realizing it. They would attribute any changes in how they felt to the food, to the pleasure of eating, to their own mood, not to the spice itself. This is part of a broader pattern with medieval spices. Many of the expensive spices that were valuable in medieval trade had psychoactive or consciousness-altering properties. Cloves, for instance, have some psychoactive properties. Pepper has mild effects. Ginger has warming properties that create different states of consciousness. When medieval people paid absurd prices for these spices, they were partly paying for flavor and partly for the consciousness-altering effects, even if they didn't think of it in those terms. What nutmeg represents is the intersection of commerce and consciousness alteration. Medieval spice traders understood that spices did things. They knew which spices were especially power. They mocked up the prices of the most consciousness-altering spices. Wealthy people paid absurd amounts for them, partly to signal status and partly for the actual effects, and the whole system of spice trade was partly built on the consciousness-altering properties of the spices being traded. Historians don't usually focus on nutmeg when discussing medieval consciousness alteration, but it fits the pattern. Medieval people had access to many consciousness-altering substances. Some were obvious and dangerous, like nightshade. Some were normalized and legal, like alcohol. Some were expensive and rare, like nutmeg, and people used them in different combinations and contexts. Sometimes deliberately, sometimes accidentally. What's also worth noting is that nutmeg intoxication has specific effects. The hallucinations are often visual. The dissociation is significant. The nausea is real. Someone who experienced nutmeg intoxication might remember it vividly, might talk about it, might attribute it to magic or witchcraft or supernatural forces. If someone was poisoned with nutmeg, if someone deliberately gave them an amount of nutmeg to cause intoxication without them knowing it, they would have a terrifying, disorienting experience that they might interpret as witchcraft. Now we come to something that gets at the heart of the medieval consciousness alteration: witchcraft connection. Datura and the flying ointment. Datura is a plant that contains tropane alkaloids similar to mandrake and henbane, but in even higher concentrations. Datura is more dangerous than either of them. If you take too much datura, you will definitely die. The line between a consciousness-altering dose and a fatal dose is very thin. Datura was known in medieval Europe, although it was probably less common than mandrake or henbane. It grows in warm climates, and it might have been cultivated in monastery, ardens, or the gardens of wealthy people. It was definitely available through trade networks. And if medieval people had access to it, they would have used it. The consciousness-altering effects of datura are profound and terrifying. You hallucinate. You lose your sense of your body. You feel like you're moving, like you're flying, like you're in a different place. The sense of time disappears. You might feel like hours have passed when it's been minutes, or vice versa. You might wake up believing that you've been to a different location, that you've had a completely different location, when in fact you've been lying in your house the whole time. Now imagine that these experiences are happening to a woman in medieval Europe. She's eaten or touched something to datura, disguised in food or rubbed on her skin. She's fallen asleep and starting to experience the consciousness-altering effects. She's feeling like she's flying, like she's traveling through the air. She's seeing visions. She's completely disoriented. And when she wakes up, she remembers having been somewhere else. She was at a gathering of witches. She was at a Sabbath. She was flying through the night. Did this actually happen? Was she really flying? From the perspective of medieval culture, yes, she experienced it. It felt real. The consciousness-altering drug created an experience that was, from her perspective, genuine. She could describe what she saw, where she went, what she did. And if other women had similar experiences from similar drugs, they could corroborate each other's accounts. This is the origin story of the witches' Sabbath. The midnight gathering of witches, the flying ointment, the orgiastic ceremony. These things might have been real experiences created by consciousness-altering ointments. The women who used them might have been having genuine experiences of consciousness alteration that fit. I interpreted as witchcraft. They might have believed they were witches. They might have even called themselves witches. The flying ointment supposedly contained various ingredients: datura, mandrake, henbane, other plants. It might have also contained animal fat to help with absorption through skin. It might have contained opium. It might have contained other consciousness-altering plants. The recipe varied depending on who was making it, but the principle was the same. Rub this on your body and you'll have consciousness-altering experiences. One particularly famous ingredient in flying ointments was toad secretions. Medieval people believed that some toads secreted a substance with psychoactive properties, and in fact, some toads do produce 5-MeO, EMT, and bufotenine, which are powerful hallucinogens. So if flying ointment contained toad secretions along with plant alkaloids, it would have been even more consciousness-altering. It would have created more intense hallucinations, more profound sense of flying or traveling. The knowledge of how to make flying ointment, how to use it, how to survive using it. This knowledge was dangerous. If you knew how to make something that would create the experience of witchcraft, if you actually tried the experience, you might come to believe you were a witch. And if you told someone else about it, they might try it too. And suddenly you have a group of women who believe they're witches, who have had the experience of witchcraft, who can describe it in detail. What happens when one of these women is arrested and interrogated? The interrogators are convinced she's a witch. She's confessed to witchcraft behaviors. They ask her for details. She describes flying, traveling, attending a gathering. Her descriptions are vivid and real because they were based on consciousness-altered experiences. The interrogators take this as confirmation that she's actually a witch. They don't consider that she might have been experiencing a drug-induced hallucination. They torture her, and she might confess to even more elaborate witchcraft activities, some of which are real, the consciousness-altered flying experiences, and some of which are false, invented under torture. The other thing about flying ointment is that it was sometimes rubbed on a broomstick or a wooden object, and then the person would straddle it while experiencing the consciousness-altering effects. So the image of witches flying on broomsticks might have originated from women rubbing flying ointment on themselves, and then sitting on a broom handle while tripping on tropane alkaloids and believing they were flying. It's darkly comedic and also genuinely tragic, because these women were then executed for something that was actually just the result of consciousness-altering drugs. Medieval women who made and used flying ointment might have genuinely believed they were witches. They might have understood themselves as having access to magical powers, to supernatural abilities. They might have thought of their consciousness alteration as contact with spiritual forces. When they were arrested and interrogated, they confessed to witchcraft, not because they were lying, but because they actually believed they were witches. From their perspective, they were. They had the experiences, they had the knowledge, they had the connections to other women who shared the experiences, and then they were executed for it. Historians still debate how common flying ointment actually was, how many women actually used it, how much of the witch trial testimony actually reflected consciousness, altering ointment experiences versus pure fabrication under torture. But there's good evidence that at least some of the accounts of witchcraft, at least some of the confessions of witchcraft, at least some of the confessions of witches, at least some of the narratives around witches' Sabbaths were based on real consciousness-altered experiences created by datura, mandrake, henbane, and other psychoactive plants. The tragedy is that women were being poisoned by consciousness-altering substances, having experiences they interpreted as magical, believing themselves to be witches, confessing to witchcraft, and then being executed. The substances that created their experiences were real. The experiences were real. The witchcraft they confessed to was not real in the sense of actual supernatural power, but it was real in the sense of consciousness alteration and altered perceptions. Now we need to expand beyond Europe, because medieval consciousness alteration wasn't limited to European substances. Through trade, through exploration, through contact with other cultures, medieval Europeans encountered new consciousness, altering substances. One of the most significant was coca, or rather coca leaves, which are mildly consciousness-altering and were used by indigenous peoples in South America. Medieval and early modern traders and explorers encountered coca when they reached South America. Coca leaves contain cocaine, which is a powerful stimulant and consciousness-altering substance. Indigenous peoples in South America had been chewing coca leaves for thousands of years. They understood its properties. They used it for consciousness alteration and for medicinal purposes. They had integrated it into their culture and trade. When Europeans encountered coca, they began bringing it back to Europe. It wasn't integrated into medieval culture the way poppies or nightshade plants were. Coca wasn't growing in Europe. It had to be imported. It was expensive. But wealthy people, people with connections to traders, people with interest in exotic substances, they had access to coca and might have experimented with it. Coca consciousness alteration is different from the consciousness alteration we've been discussing. Cocaine is a stimulant. It makes you feel energized, alert, focused. It's consciousness alteration in the direction of increased awareness rather than dissociation. It reduces fatigue, reduces hunger, increases confidence. It was useful for work that required focus and energy, which is partly why indigenous peoples used it. What's important to understand is that medieval and early modern Europeans were beginning to encounter a global marketplace of consciousness, altering substances. Coca from South America, opium from the Islamic world, cannabis and other plants from Central Asia and India, spices from the Spice Islands, all flowing into Europe through trade networks. Wealthy people had access to more consciousness-altering options than ever before. Medieval physicians who had access to knowledge of these exotic substances would have been interested in them. Coca might have been recommended for fatigue, for low mood, for work that required sustained effort. It would have fit into the framework of medicine and health, just like poppy and other consciousness-altering plants. The introduction of coca to Europeans is also part of a larger story of global colonialism and exploitation. Coca was valuable partly because it was consciousness-altering. European demand for consciousness-altering substances was part of what drove the colonization of the Americas and the extraction of resources from indigenous peoples. So in some sense, medieval and early modern European consciousness alteration preferences were complicit in the beginning of global imperialism. One thing that's worth noting is that coca, unlike many of the consciousness-altering substances we've discussed, is less associated with witchcraft accusations. Coca is a stimulant, not a hallucinogen. It doesn't create the disorienting, terrifying experiences that henbane or datura create. So even if medieval Europeans were using coca, it wouldn't have the same connection to accusations of witchcraft and demonic possession. By the late medieval and early modern period, coca is becoming more available, more known about, beginning to be used by some Europeans. But it's still exotic, still limited to people with money and connections, still not as central to consciousness alteration as fermented beverages or European-grown plants. What coca represents in the medieval consciousness alteration story is the beginning of a global marketplace in consciousness alteration substances. Medieval people had consciousness-altering options that were local to Europe. Early modern and modern people had consciousness-altering options from all over the world. The expansion of consciousness-altering options parallels the expansion of global trade and imperialism. It also represents the fact that consciousness alteration is universal. Different cultures developed consciousness alteration practices using different plants, but the impulse, the desire to alter consciousness, to escape from normal experience, to feel different, that's everywhere. Medieval Europeans had fermented beverages and nightshade plants. Andean peoples had coca. Southeast Asian peoples had cannabis. The substances varied, but the drive was the same. Historians of medieval consciousness alteration sometimes focus only on European substances and don't consider the global dimension. But if we're trying to understand the full picture of what consciousness-altering options were available to medieval people, we have to include exotic imports like coca, even if they were rare and limited to small populations. Now we need to talk about one of the most significant developments in medieval consciousness alteration, the invention of distillation and the creation of spirits. This is a moment where consciousness alteration technology changed fundamentally. Before distillation, the strongest consciousness-altering beverage you could make was wine or strong ale, maybe 12 to 15% alcohol at most. After distillation, you could make something that was 40, 50, sometimes 60% alcohol or higher. The technology for distillation existed in ancient times, but the medieval period is when it became widely adopted in Europe. Alchemists were the first people to do serious distillation work. trying to extract the essence of things. They were trying to create the pure spiritual form of a substance through distillation. When they distilled wine, they created something that was much more powerful than wine, something that was clear and strong. They called it aqua vitae, water of life. Aqua vitae was revolutionary. It was consciousness-altering in a completely different way than wine. A small amount could make you significantly intoxicated. It burned your throat when you drank it. It had a clear, pure, intense quality. It was powerful. It was different. It was exciting and dangerous. Once the technology for distillation existed, it spread quickly. People realized you could distill wine into a much stronger beverage. You could do the same thing with grains, creating whiskey or vodka or other spirits. You could do it with herbs, creating various medicinal and consciousness-altering tinctures. You could create different spirits depending on what you distilled and how you distilled it. The social impact of distilled spirits was significant. Wine had been the luxury consciousness-altering beverage of the wealthy. Spirits were initially also luxury items, but they were more portable, more concentrated, more shelf-stable than wine. You could transport spirits more easily than wine. You could store them longer. You could added them more easily. Spirits became a new form of wealth and trade. Distilled spirits also changed the nature of intoxication. Fermented beverages produced mild intoxication, spread over time. Distilled spirits produced intense intoxication quickly. You could drink a small amount of spirits and get very drunk very fast. This was a different experience. It was more intense, more immediate, more powerful. With distilled spirits came a new set of problems. Alcoholism became more problematic. People could get much drunker much faster. The health consequences of alcohol consumption became worse. There was more violence associated with intoxication. There were more moral panics about the dangers of drinking. Medieval people understood this. There were warnings about the dangers of spirits. There were concerns that spirits were making people sick, making them violent, making them lose control. But spirits were also valuable trade goods, and they were also really effective at consciousness alteration. So people kept making them and using them despite the dangers. Distilled spirits also changed the medical use of consciousness-altering substances. Alcohol had been used as a solvent for medicines and as a medicine itself. Distilled spirits were even more effective for this purpose. You could dissolve herbs and other medicinal substances in spirits and create tinctures that were much stronger than the substances in water or wine. Medieval physicians and apothecaries started using distilled spirits as a base for medicinal preparations. They would infuse herbs into spirits and create medicines. These medicines could contain consciousness-altering substances, poppy, for instance, dissolved in distilled spirits. A small amount of this medicine would be extremely potent, so you could administer a more effective dose in a smaller volume. The other thing about distilled spirits is that they could be flavored and altered. You could create different spirits by distilling different things. You could add herbs and spices to spirits to create different effects. You could create a whole class of consciousness-altering beverages that were much more customizable than fermented beverages. Historians often mark the introduction of distilled spirits to Europe as a turning point in consciousness alteration. From that point on, stronger intoxication became possible and more common. The nature of intoxication changed from the mild, continuous intoxication of fermented beverages to the acute, intense intoxication of spirits. What's also important is that distilled spirits connected to other consciousness-altering substances. You could dissolve poppy products in spirits. You could dissolve other plants in spirits. You could create much more powerful and customizable consciousness-altering solutions than you could with fermented beverages alone. So, distillation technology opened up new possibilities for combining consciousness-altering substances. By the late medieval period, distillation was established technology. Spirits were being produced widely. They were becoming more accessible to lower classes of people, even though they were initially luxury goods, and the consciousness alteration landscape was changing, becoming more intense, more acute, more powerful. The invention of distillation also showed something important about the medieval approach to consciousness alteration. It was technological. Medieval people didn't just accept what nature gave them. They developed technology to make consciousness alteration more intense and more controllable. Fermentation was technology. Distillation was technology. Different preparations and combinations were all technologies for altering consciousness more effectively. At this point, we need to talk about laudanum, which represents the endpoint of medieval consciousness alteration technology. Laudanum is opium dissolved in alcohol. It's an incredibly potent consciousness-altering substance. A small amount of laudanum can produce powerful consciousness alteration. It was essentially a medieval, early modern version of liquid heroin. Laudanum was invented sometime in the late medieval or early modern period. The exact date is debated, but it represents a refinement and combination of technologies. Distillation to create alcohol, extraction to separate opium from poppy, and dissolution to combine them. The result was something that was much stronger and much easier to dose than anything that had come before. Once laudanum was available, it became popular. It was prescribed as medicine for pain, for insomnia, for anxiety, for almost anything. It was effective. It genuinely did help with pain and anxiety and insomnia. It also was addictive, and it was easy to become dependent on it, and it was easy to overdose on it. But medieval and early modern physicians prescribed it widely, often without fully understanding the dangers. What's important to understand is that laudanum was available. You could buy it from apothecaries. You didn't need a special prescription or medical knowledge. If you had money, you could get laudanum. And once you could get it, you had access to a consciousness-altering substance that was more potent than anything that had been easily available before. Laudanum made it possible to have intense consciousness alteration in a small, portable, easy-to-use form. You could carry it with you. You could measure a dose easily. You could use it in public without anyone knowing. You could drink a small amount and experience significant consciousness alteration. It was the most effective way to alter consciousness that medieval and early modern people had access to. The social impact of laudanum was significant. People became addicted to it. Some people used it for self-medication. Some people used it for recreation. Some people used it for medical purposes and became addicted without meaning to. The whole class system of consciousness alteration, where wealthy people had access to more options and more potent options, was intensified by laudanum, because laudanum was expensive enough that it was still a class marker, but it was available enough that people with some resources could get it. What's also important is that laudanum represented a change in consciousness alteration from collective to individual. Fermented beverages were shared. You drank beer with other people. You drank wine with others. Incense was a shared experience. But laudanum was something you could use alone in private, without anyone knowing. It enabled a kind of private consciousness alteration that didn't require social structures or shared ritual. Laudanum also enabled a kind of consciousness alteration that was more continuous than previous options. You could dose laudanum multiple times a day. You could maintain a constant state of mild intoxication or pain relief. Some people probably did this, creating a kind of continuous consciousness alteration that was maintained through regular dosing of laudanum. By the late medieval and early modern period, laudanum is becoming more common, more accessible, more standardized. It represents the full development of consciousness, altering technology in the medieval period. You have fermented beverages for basic intoxication. You have plants with consciousness, altering properties for hallucinogenic experiences. You have distilled spirits for intense, acute intoxication. And you have laudanum for potent, portable, easy-to-use consciousness alteration. The existence of laudanum also enabled something that hadn't been possible before: standardization of consciousness alteration. With fermented beverages, the strength could vary. With plant preparations, the dosage was hard to control. With laudanum, you could have a predictable, measurable dose. This was better in some ways. You could know how much you were taking. You could be more careful about addiction. But it was also worse in other ways. It made it easier to become addicted. It made it easier to overdose. It removed some of the barriers that kept people from using consciousness-altering substances too heavily. One more important thing. Laudanum shows how medieval consciousness alteration technology was converging with what we would now call modern drug use. Laudanum is essentially tincture of opium. which is a liquid opioid. It's on a spectrum with heroin and other modern opioid drugs. Medieval and early modern people were using consciousness, altering substances in ways that are very similar to how modern people use drugs. Buying them from a supplier, using them for pain relief and recreation, becoming addicted, risking overdose. The difference is the framing. Laudanum was respectable. It was medicine. It was legal. You could use it without shame or legal consequence. But the actual behavior, the addiction, the dosing, the self-medication, the consciousness alteration, was fundamentally the same as modern drug use. So by the medieval and early modern period, European consciousness alteration had reached a form that was very similar to modern drug use in all but name and legality. There are other consciousness-altering substances we haven't fully covered yet. Mushrooms and fungi. Medieval people knew that certain mushrooms had consciousness-altering properties. They knew that some mushrooms would kill you, and some would make you hallucinate. The question was knowing which was which. There are psychoactive mushrooms that grow wild in Europe, psilocybin mushrooms and other species that contain psilocybin and psilocybin, which are powerful hallucinogens. If you found these mushrooms, if you ate them, you would hallucinate. You would have profound consciousness alteration, and if you survived, you might do it again because the experience is genuinely interesting and consciousness altering in ways that people seek out. Medieval people knew about these mushrooms. There are accounts in medieval sources of people eating mushrooms and having strange experiences. Some of these accounts might be referring to psychoactive mushrooms. Some might be referring to poisonous mushrooms that cause delirium before death. The accounts are often unclear about which is which. The challenge with mushroom consciousness alteration is that it's risky. Some mushrooms are deadly. Some are mildly toxic. Some are psychoactive without being deadly. Some are psychoactive and deadly. The margin between a dose that produces consciousness alteration and a dose that produces death is often narrow. You have to really know what you're doing to use mushrooms safely for consciousness alteration. This means that deliberate consciousness alteration through mushrooms was probably limited to people with specific knowledge, herbalists, healers, people who had learned about mushrooms and could identify them accurately. But accidental consciousness alteration through mushrooms might have been more common. You might eat a mushroom thinking it was edible and discover that it had consciousness-altering properties, or you might have a bad reaction and interpret it as supernatural attack or poisoning. There's also the question of whether medieval people cultivated psychoactive mushrooms deliberately. This is speculative, but it's possible that some monks or herbalists might have tried to cultivate them. Mushrooms need specific conditions to grow. Darkness, moisture, particular substrates. If you knew what conditions psychoactive mushrooms needed, you might be able to grow them deliberately. But the evidence for this is limited. Most of what we know about medieval mushroom use comes from accounts that are ambiguous about whether the mushrooms were deliberately sought for consciousness alteration or accidentally encountered. The accounts often describe illness or strangeness without clarifying whether the person was seeking that outcome. What's important is that mushrooms were available. They were growing wild. Some of them were consciousness altering. Some medieval people probably used them deliberately. Some probably encountered them accidentally. And the experiences they created, hallucinations, dissociation, terror, would have been interpreted through medieval cultural frameworks, which meant potentially being interpreted as witchcraft or supernatural attack. The other thing about mushrooms is that they represent a form of consciousness alteration that doesn't require any processing or preparation technology. You find the mushroom, you eat it, you have consciousness alteration. No fermentation, no distillation, no extraction. Just a direct ingestion of a naturally consciousness-altering substance. This made mushrooms accessible to anyone who could identify them and find them. One important historical note. Some scholars have speculated that famous medieval and early modern religious experiences, the visions of medieval saints, the experiences described by medieval mystics, might have been at least partly influenced by mushroom use. This is speculative, but it's interesting to consider. If medieval religious figures had access to psychoactive mushrooms, if they had experiences that they interpreted as divine visions, then the mystical and religious dimensions of medieval Christianity might have had a consciousness-altering substance component that's invisible in the historical record. Historians debate the extent of medieval mushroom consciousness alteration use. Some scholars think it was relatively rare. Others think it was more common, but left few records. The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. But there's definitely evidence that psychoactive mushrooms existed in medieval Europe, that medieval people knew about them, and that at least some consciousness alteration through mushrooms was happening. What mushrooms represent in the landscape of medieval consciousness alteration is another option. Another plant-based consciousness alteration substance that was available and that medieval people probably used to some extent. At this point, we should talk about where all these consciousness-altering substances came from. The monastery gardens. Monasteries were the centers of learning in medieval Europe. They were places where plants were cultivated, where knowledge was preserved and accumulated, where experiments were conducted. And monasteries grew consciousness, altering plants. Monks grew poppies in monastery gardens. They grew mandrake, they grew henbane. They grew other plants with consciousness, altering properties. The question is why? The official answer is that these plants were grown for medicinal purposes. Poppy for pain, mandrake for various ailments, henbane for medical uses. But there's also a question about whether monks deliberately grew these plants for the consciousness-altering effects themselves. Monks took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They were supposed to renounce worldly pleasures. They were not supposed to seek consciousness, alteration, or intoxication. And yet, monasteries were centers of beer production and alcohol distribution. Monasteries grew consciousness-altering plants. Monasteries had access to spices and other substances that could be used for consciousness alteration. There's an obvious contradiction here. One way to resolve this is to assume that monks were just hypocrites, that they preached against intoxication while engaging in it themselves. This is probably partly true, but there's another way to understand it. Monks understood consciousness alteration as being part of spiritual practice. Altered consciousness could bring you closer to God. Consciousness alteration could be a legitimate spiritual experience, not a sinful indulgence. We can see this in the uses of incense in religious services. Incense altered consciousness. We've already established that, but incense was used deliberately in religious services, presumably to enhance spiritual experience. Why wouldn't consciousness-altering plants be used the same way? Why wouldn't monks deliberately use consciousness-altering substances to enhance their spiritual experience? The answer is probably that some monks did. The hypocrisy of the Church's official stance against intoxication and the actual use of consciousness-altering substances in monastic life suggests that there was some deliberate use happening. Monks might have taken consciousness-altering substances in private to enhance meditation or prayer. They might have shared them with each other. They might have created a monastic culture where consciousness alteration was part of spiritual practice, even if it was officially forbidden. Monasteries were also places where knowledge accumulated. If you wanted to know how to cultivate consciousness-altering plants, how to prepare them, how to use them effectively and safely, monasteries would have been places where that knowledge was preserved. Monks would have had access to herbals that contained information about these plants. They would have had practical experience with growing them. They would have had knowledge about different preparations and effects. Some of that knowledge might have left the monasteries. If monks were training people, if they were sharing knowledge with people who wanted to learn about plants, then consciousness-altering plant knowledge would have spread beyond the monastery. Women herbalists and healers might have learned about these plants from monks or from resources that monks had access to. The knowledge that created accusations of witchcraft might have had roots in monastic learning. There's also the question of intentionality about what was grown in monastery gardens. If you wanted to grow consciousness-altering plants, you could easily justify it as growing medicinal plants. No one would question it. You could cultivate mandrake and henbane and other plants openly because they were in the medical literature as legitimate medicines. You could grow poppies because opium was used medically. You could grow cannabis because hemp was valuable for fiber and also had medicinal uses. So monks could deliberately cultivate consciousness-altering plants while maintaining plausible deniability. They were just following the herbals. They were just cultivating medicinal plants. If monks also used these plants for consciousness alteration, that was a separate matter, and one that they might keep quiet about. What's important is that monasteries made consciousness-altering plant cultivation accessible. They preserved the knowledge. They demonstrated the techniques. They made the plants available. In a world where literacy was rare and knowledge was scarce, monastic gardens were centers of plant knowledge, and that knowledge included consciousness-altering plants. The other role monasteries played was in producing and distributing beer and wine. Monasteries made excellent beer. Monasteries produced wine. Monasteries were major centers of alcohol production and distribution. This was not just incendiary. Egypt, this was not just incidental to their other activities. This was a significant economic activity. Monasteries made money off alcohol production. They distributed it widely. They were major players in medieval consciousness alteration in the most normalized and socially acceptable form. So monasteries had a dual role in medieval consciousness alteration. On one level, they were producing and distributing the most normalized consciousness-altering substance, alcohol, through beer and wine. On another level, they were cultivating and potentially using more powerful consciousness-altering substances for medicinal and possibly spiritual purposes. And they were preserving knowledge about plants and consciousness alteration that connected to herbal medicine, witchcraft, and spiritual practice. Historians still debate how much of this was intentional and how much was incidental, but everyone agrees that monasteries were central to medieval consciousness alteration in multiple ways. Let's talk about tavern culture, because the social dimension of medieval consciousness alteration is just as important as the substances themselves. A tavern was more than just a place to drink. It was the main public space, where people gathered, where community happened, where social bonds formed. You went to the tavern to drink, yes, but you also went to belong. You went to be part of something. You went to hear news, to make deals, to celebrate, to commiserate. The tavern was where you felt connected to other people, and consciousness alteration was the medium through which that connection happened. You drank together, and through drinking you formed bonds. This was social consciousness alteration. It wasn't just about the chemical effects of the alcohol, though that was part of it. It was about the meaning of drinking together, the rituals, the feeling of belonging, the sense that you were part of a community. Medieval people understood that consciousness alteration was a social act, something you did with others, something that bonded you to other people. Tavern culture was also where the rules of consciousness alteration were established and enforced. You didn't drink too much, or if you did, there were consequences. You didn't get violent, or if you did, you were removed. You were supposed to treat other drinkers with respect. You were supposed to pay for what you consumed. You were supposed to follow the social rules of the tavern. These rules existed because consciousness alteration can be chaotic. If everyone got drunk and violent and lost all self-control, the tavern wouldn't function. So there were rules, and those rules were enforced, and they made it possible for consciousness alteration to happen within a social structure. The tavern was a space where consciousness alteration was normalized, but also contained and managed. What's also important is that tavern culture provided a frame for consciousness alteration that was different from the medical or spiritual frames. In the tavern, you were drinking for pleasure and for social connection, not because it was medicine or because it was part of religious practice. This frame made it clear that consciousness alteration for its own sake, for the feeling of it, for the social bonding, for the pleasure, was acceptable. Tavern culture was also gendered in specific ways. Women operated taverns. Women worked as servers and bartenders. Women worked as servers and bartenders. Women drank in taverns, though sometimes not in the same spaces as men. Women were part of tavern culture, though often in circumscribed roles. The women who ran taverns, the alewives and tavern keepers. These women had economic power and social power. They came from selling consciousness-altering substances. Tavern keepers understood the consciousness-altering effects of what they were selling. They knew that different drinks had different effects. They knew that people wanted to get drunk, wanted to feel different. They managed the consciousness alteration that happened in their establishments. They were the experts in medieval consciousness alteration, though they wouldn't have used that language. In the tavern, You could also buy consciousness-altering substances beyond just fermented beverages. If you knew who to ask, you could probably find someone who would sell you herbs or opium preparations or other substances. The tavern was the place where consciousness-altering substances were available, and where knowledge about consciousness alteration was shared. What's particularly interesting is that tavern consciousness alteration was democratic in a certain way. Unlike wine or spices or medicines, which required resources, beer was available to people without much money. A medieval peasant could go to the tavern and get beer that was affordable. You didn't have to be wealthy to participate in consciousness alteration through drinking in the tavern. This meant that tavern consciousness alteration was probably more widespread and more central to medieval life than the consciousness alteration of the wealthy through rare spices or fine wines. Most medieval people's consciousness alteration was probably happening in taverns through beer as part of social bonding and community formation. There was also a dark side to tavern consciousness alteration. People got drunk and made poor decisions. People gambled money they didn't have. People got into fights. People hurt each other. Some people got addicted to alcohol, and their lives fell apart. Tavern consciousness alteration had real costs, even though it also had real benefits for community and social bonding. What tavern culture shows is that medieval consciousness alteration wasn't just about individual experience or med-icing. It was about social structures and community and belonging. It was woven through the fabric of daily life. It was how people connected to each other. The consciousness alteration was the vehicle through which social relationships happened. By the late medieval period, taverns were established institutions. They were regulated by towns which set prices and standards. They were expected to maintain order. They were licensed and taxed. They were part of the official structure of medieval towns. Consciousness alteration had become so central to medieval society that the places where it happened were official, regulated institutions. Now we need to talk about something that we've been circling around, but haven't fully addressed. The women who knew about consciousness-altering substances, the herbalists, the healers, the apothecaries, the women who understood plants and medicine. These women had knowledge that was valuable and dangerous, and they were often the targets of witch hunts. A woman who knew which plants could be used for consciousness alteration, how to prepare them, how to dose them. This was valuable knowledge. She could heal people. She could help with pain. She could assist with difficult pregnancies. She could treat various ailments. She had skills that other people didn't have. She had power that came from knowledge, but that knowledge was also dangerous. If a woman gave someone something that had bad effects, if someone had a terrifying experience from consciousness alteration, if something went wrong, the woman who provided the substance could be blamed. And if the woman was already marginalized, if she was someone without family or protection, if she was poor or older, or different in some way, then the blame could turn into accusation of witchcraft. A woman who knew about mandrake or henbane or datrua or belladonna, a woman who had these plants, a woman who gave them to someone for medicinal purposes or consciousness alteration, this woman was potentially at risk for witchcraft accusations. If the person who consumed the substance had a bad experience, they might blame it on witchcraft. If the woman had a reputation for knowing strange things, for working with plants, for being different, then the accusation had some basis in reality. She did know about consciousness, altering substances. She did administer them to people. The fact that she was doing it for legitimate reasons didn't matter if the narrative of witchcraft took hold. What's particularly important is that some women probably did understand themselves as witches. If a woman had knowledge of consciousness-altering substances, if she had the power to make someone experience altered consciousness, if she had knowledge that seemed supernatural to other people, then she might identify as having some kind of magical power. The line between a woman who knows about plants and a witch might have been blurry, at least partly because the plants actually did consciousness, altering things that felt magical. The women who were executed for witchcraft, some of them might have actually been consciousness-altering substance experts. Some of them might have been using flying ointment themselves and having experiences they believed were witchcraft. Some of them might have been deliberately giving consciousness-altering substances to people. Some of them might have just known too much about plants and been in the wrong place at the wrong time when a moral panic about witchcraft took hold. What's tragic is that the knowledge these women had was valuable. Knowledge. The plants they knew about had real medicinal and consciousness-altering properties. The techniques they had developed for preparation and dosing were sophisticated. They were doing genuine herbal medicine, and they were killed for it. Witch trials happened partly because of consciousness. Altering substances. The substances created confusing experiences that people couldn't explain. People blamed witches. They looked for someone to blame, and often that someone was a woman who actually did know about consciousness-altering substances. The knowledge and the accusation overlapped. The woman really did have access to consciousness-altering substances, and that made the accusation seem more plausible. It's impossible to know how many of the women executed for witchcraft were actually engaged in consciousness-altering substance use or provision. Probably some. Probably not most. Many of the witchcraft accusations were clearly false and malicious, but the overlap between knowledge of consciousness-altering plants and witchcraft accusations was real, and it was tragic. The women who had the most sophisticated knowledge of consciousness alteration in medieval Europe were often the women most at risk of being killed for witchcraft. What's also worth noting is that this created a chilling effect on the transmission of knowledge. If knowing about consciousness-altering plants could get you killed, you were less likely to share that knowledge. You were less likely to teach other women. The knowledge that women had developed over generations was suppressed. Some of it was lost. The other thing is that after significant witch hunts, there was often a gap in the knowledge of herbal medicine and consciousness-altering substances. The women who had that knowledge were dead. The surviving women were less likely to practice openly. The oral tradition was broken, so witch hunts literally destroyed knowledge that had been accumulated and refined over centuries. By the time the medieval period ended and the early modern period began, the knowledge that women had about consciousness-altering substance was much more suppressed than it had been. The official physicians and apothecaries were increasingly male and academic, working from learned texts rather than practical knowledge. The folk knowledge that women had about plants and consciousness alteration was driven underground. This is one of the costs of witch hunts that's often not discussed. The loss of sophisticated knowledge about consciousness-altering substances and herbal medicine. The women who had this knowledge were eliminated from society. Their knowledge died with them, or survived only in fragments, and society lost the benefit of their expertise. Historians have started recognizing this connection between witch hunts and the suppression of women's knowledge about plants and consciousness-altering substances, but for a long time it was overlooked. The focus was on the false accusations, the injustice, the tragedy of innocent people being killed. But some of the people who were killed were not innocent of what they were accused. They really did know about consciousness-altering substances, and their knowledge, their expertise, their power was a threat to a society that was increasingly trying to control and regulate consciousness alteration. Let's talk about class, because consciousness alteration in medieval society was deeply stratified by wealth and status. What you had access to, what you could afford, what you could legally do. All of this depended on your social class. A peasant's consciousness alteration was beer. You drank beer because the water wasn't safe and beer was affordable. You might drink it at the tavern sometimes, creating a social consciousness alteration experience. You might occasionally have access to other things, maybe mead if you were lucky, maybe some herbs, but mostly it was beer. Your consciousness alteration was limited, available, cheap, and integrated into daily work. And survival. A merchant or someone with moderate wealth had more options. You could afford wine occasionally. You could buy spices, maybe including consciousness-altering ones. You could hire an apothecary or physician if you got sick, and they might give you opium or other consciousness-altering medicines. You could afford to get drunk on stronger beverages at special occasions. Your consciousness alteration was more varied and more optional than a peasant's. A noble or wealthy person had access to almost everything. You could have wine regularly. You could have rare spices that cost absurd amounts. You could hire physicians who would prepare complex medicinal consciousness-altering preparations. You could afford to experiment with rare and expensive consciousness-altering substances. You could have private access to consciousness alteration rather than needing to go to a tavern. Your consciousness alteration was varied, powerful, controlled, and completely normalized as part of your lifestyle. This class stratification of consciousness alteration tells us something important. Consciousness alteration in medieval society was a marker of status. What you could access and afford was a clear signal of your social position. The quality and type of consciousness alteration you had access to reflected your wealth and power. Wealth created options for consciousness alteration, but it also created power. If you had access to consciousness-altering substances that other people didn't have, if you could control access to those substances, you had a form of power. This is partly why wealthy people wanted spices and fine wines, not just for the consciousness-altering effects, but because controlling access to consciousness-altering substances was a way of exercising and displaying power. There's also the question of how consciousness-altering substances became luxury goods. Some substances were inherently expensive because they were rare. Spices had to be traded from far away. They were precious. They could be used as currency. But some substances became expensive because of artificial scarcity or because they were controlled by authorities. Opium might have been expensive partly because someone was controlling access to it and charging high prices. The church was involved in this stratification. The church had access to consciousness-altering substances through monasteries. The church approved some consciousness-altering practices like incense in religious services and disapproved of others like drunkenness. The church's approval or disapproval could affect whether something was legal and whether someone would be punished for using it. Women and consciousness-altering substances were also stratified by class. A wealthy woman could use belladonna to dilate her pupils because she could afford it, and because her beauty practices were part of her status. A poor woman using consciousness-altering substances would be less visible and might be more at risk for witchcraft accusations because her use of the substances couldn't be easily explained as medicine or beauty practice. What's important is understanding that consciousness alteration wasn't equally available or equally safe depending on your social position. Wealthy people had more options, more control, more ability to use consciousness-altering substances without legal or social consequence. Poor people had fewer options, less control, and were at higher risk for negative consequences. The stratification also meant that knowledge about consciousness-altering substances was not equally distributed. Wealthy people had access to physicians and apothecaries who had learned knowledge. Poor people had access to folk knowledge which was valuable, but sometimes less reliable. Women healers had sophisticated knowledge, but were at risk for persecution. Knowledge was concentrated in some places and among some people. By the late medieval period, the stratification of consciousness alteration was becoming formalized. There were regulations about who could practice medicine, who could be an apothecary, who could sell consciousness-altering substances. These regulations generally favored wealthy, educated men. They excluded women, poor people, and people without formal training. The informal distributed system of consciousness alteration that had existed earlier was becoming more formal and more controlled. This is relevant to understanding the later suppression of consciousness alteration. By the early modern period, governments and authorities were trying to control consciousness-altering substances more systematically. They were regulating who could produce them, who could sell them, who could use them. The stratified access that had characterized medieval consciousness alteration was becoming even more stratified, with authorities attempting to limit consciousness-altering substances to official, controlled, legal channels. Understanding class stratification of consciousness alteration helps us see that medieval consciousness alteration wasn't a uniform experience. It depended on who you were, how much money you had, what gender you were, what authorities you had access to. The landscape of consciousness alteration in medieval Europe was diverse and complex, and deeply tied to social structures and power dynamics. Let's talk about the church's relationship to consciousness-altering substances because it's complicated and contradictory in revealing ways. The official position of the church was that drunkenness was a sin. Intoxication was wrong. People should resist the temptation to alter their consciousness through alcohol. Monks and priests especially should avoid intoxication. They had taken vows that precluded it, and yet the church produced beer. The church produced wine. The church used wine in the sacred ritual of communion, which was the central Christian sacrament. The church burned incense, which altered consciousness. The church approved of medicines that contained consciousness-altering substances. The church preserved knowledge of consciousness-altering plants in monastery gardens and monastic herbals. So the church was officially against consciousness alteration, while being one of the major producers and distributors of consciousness-altering substances. This contradiction is resolved by framing. Consciousness-altering substances were acceptable if they were produced for medical purposes, for religious purposes, or if they were necessary for survival. Like beer, which was necessary for survival. Like beer, which was necessary because water wasn't safe. They were wrong if they were used for pleasure, for intoxication, for conscious rebellion against church authority. But this framing was thin. Most of the beer produced by monks was going to be drunk by people who might not have had access to safe water, but who were also probably enjoying getting drunk. Most of the wine produced by the church was going to be used in religious services, but wealthy people also drank wine for pleasure. Most of the consciousness-altering plants in monastery gardens were supposedly for medicine, but monks also had access to them and might have used them. The church's actual stance on consciousness alteration was probably more accepting than the official doctrine suggested. Monks probably engaged in consciousness alteration. Priests probably drank alcohol. The church's leadership certainly had access to the best consciousness-altering substances available. The preachers who condemned drunkenness were probably themselves engaging in some level of consciousness alteration through the deed. Drinks and medicines available to them. What the church was really controlling wasn't whether consciousness alteration happened, but how it was framed and who had the right to do it. Consciousness alteration was acceptable if you were a monk. Part of your duty to produce and manage consciousness-altering substances. If you were wealthy, accessing fine wines and medicines. If you were participating in religious ritual, incense in church. If you had medical reasons, taking medicine prescribed by a physician. Consciousness alteration was wrong. If you were a peasant getting drunk in the tavern for the pleasure of it. If you were a woman using consciousness-altering substances for reasons the church didn't approve of. If you were using consciousness-altering substances to resist church authority, or to access experiences that the church said should be accessible only through official channels. The church was in some ways monopolizing the most powerful consciousness-altering experiences. Religious ritual with incense and wine and music and imagery was the official consciousness-altering experience that the church controlled. If you wanted consciousness alteration, you were supposed to get it through church-sanctioned methods in church-approved contexts, under church-approved contexts, under church supervision. Other forms of consciousness alteration, flying ointments, mushrooms, unauthorized medicines, were threats to this monopoly. This is partly why witch hunts happened. Witches were people who had access to consciousness-altering experiences outside of church control. They were having experiences that felt spiritual and supernatural. Experiences that could be as powerful as religious experiences, but happening in unauthorized contexts, with unauthorized substances, under no church supervision. That was threatening. One interesting thing to note, the church's stance on opium and other consciousness-altering medicines changed over time. Laudanum, when it was invented, was initially accepted as legitimate medicine. But as it became clear that people were using laudanum for pleasure and becoming addicted to it, there was more concern. The church and authorities started trying to regulate it, but they never successfully eliminated it. People kept using it because it was effective. The other thing is that the church's attempts to control consciousness alteration were never fully successful. People continued to use consciousness-altering substances in ways the church disapproved of. Women healers continued to use plants. People continued to drink for pleasure. Monks continued to enjoy the consciousness, altering effects of substances they produced. The church's prohibitions affected behavior at the margins, but they didn't eliminate consciousness alteration. By the late medieval period, the church's relationship to consciousness alteration was becoming more strained, as authorities, both church and secular, tried to regulate and control consciousness-altering substances more systematically. They ran up against the reality that consciousness alteration is deeply woven through human culture and society. You can't just eliminate it. You can only regulate who has access to it and under what conditions. What's important about understanding the Church's role in consciousness alteration is recognizing that institutions were not separate from consciousness alteration. They were central to it. The Church didn't just condemn consciousness alteration. It managed it, controlled it, benefited from it. Understanding medieval consciousness alteration requires understanding how institutions like the Church were involved in producing, distributing, framing, and controlling consciousness-altering substances. We come now to the end of our journey through medieval consciousness alteration, and we need to ask the final question: why? Why did medieval people seek consciousness alteration? Why do people seek it now? What is it about consciousness that makes us want to alter it? The answer is probably simpler and more complicated than any single explanation. Medieval people sought consciousness alteration for the same reason people seek it now. Because consciousness, as it usually is, can be difficult, painful, boring, or limited. Because sometimes you want to feel different. Because sometimes you want to escape. Because sometimes you want to feel connected to something larger than yourself. Because sometimes you want to access experiences that normal consciousness doesn't provide. Medieval people's consciousness alteration was shaped by their specific context, the specific plants available to them, the specific framework of religion and medicine and culture that they used to understand consciousness alteration, the specific dangers they faced. But the underlying impulse was human. It's universal. People everywhere and everywhen seek consciousess alteration. Medieval people were also, in many ways, just like us. They had similar brains to us. They had similar capabilities for consciousness alteration and similar responses to consciousness alteration. Substances. They experienced addiction. They experienced bad trips. They experienced healing. They experienced transcendence. The experiences were the same. The context was different. What medieval consciousness alteration shows us is that consciousness alteration is not a modern invention or a modern problem. It's ancient, it's human, it's woven through culture and society. You can't have human civilization without consciousness alteration, because consciousness alteration is part of what humans do. We alter consciousness through substances, through practices, through rituals, through art, through spirituality. Medieval soccer, through spirituality. Medieval soccer. Society had consciousness alteration embedded in almost every level. Fermented beverages that everyone drank, plants that people knew about, medicines that contained consciousness, altering substances, religious practices that involved consciousness alteration, social practices that revolved around consciousness alteration, people deliberately using consciousness alteration, substances for medical, spiritual, and recreational purposes. And the consequences were similar to modern consciousness alteration. Consequences: addiction, overdose, bad reactions, disruption of lives, but also genuine benefits, genuine healing, genuine spiritual experience, genuine social connection. Consciousness alteration was complex in medieval times, just like it is now. What's also striking is how little has fundamentally changed in the basic technologies and practices. We still ferment grain to make beer. We still use opium as medicine and for consciousness alteration. We still have plants with consciousness-altering properties that people use deliberately. We still have different substances available depending on your wealth and status. We still have legal restrictions on some consciousness-altering substances and not others. We still have moral frameworks around consciousness alteration that are partly about the substance and partly about the framing. The main differences are technological. We now have distilled spirits much more accessible. We have synthesized drugs. We have pharmaceutical consciousness alteration. We have ways to make consciousness alteration more intense and more precise. But the underlying practices, the underlying impulse, the underlying reality of consciousness alteration as part of human experience, that's the same. Medieval people wouldn't have had the vocabulary for what we mean by consciousness alteration. They would have called it medicine or intoxication or spiritual experience. But they were doing it. They understood that certain substances changed consciousness. They sought out those substances. They used them in various ways for various purposes. They dealt with the consequences. What medieval consciousness alteration teaches us is that this is human. This is how humans are. We seek consciousness alteration. It's not something that happened because we're decadent or immoral or lost. It happened because we're human. Medieval people were just like us, looking for escape, looking for transcendence, looking for escape, looking for relief, looking for connection, looking for something beyond what normal consciousness offers. And they found it in beer and wine and spices and plants and medicines and religious experiences. They found it in taverns and churches and monasteries and the gardens where they grew herbs. They found it in ways that were sometimes healing and sometimes destructive. They found it despite institutional opposition and social stigma. They found it because the human impulse to alter consciousness is powerful and persistent. The legacy of medieval consciousness alteration is in the substances we still use. Beer, wine, opium. It's in the social structures we still have. Bars, doctors, medicine. It's in the regulations we still have about consciousness-altering substances. It's in the moral frameworks we still have about what consciousness alteration is acceptable and what isn't. Medieval consciousness alteration is directly connected to modern consciousness alteration through an unbroken chain of practice and substance and culture. What we learn from medieval consciousness alteration is not that we should condemn it or moralize about it, but that we should understand it as fundamentally human. Medieval people sought consciousness alteration and found ways to do it. They lived in a society where consciousness alteration was woven through almost everything, and they were trying to survive, to feel less pain, to feel connected, to feel something other than the baseline of existence in a genuinely difficult world. The impulse hasn't changed. The substances have changed somewhat. The context has changed. The framing has changed. But underneath all of that, humans are still seeking what medieval people sought: a break from ordinary consciousness, a way to feel different, a way to escape or transcend or heal or connect. Medieval consciousness alteration teaches us that this isn't new, this isn't modern, this is human. And understanding that might help us approach our own consciousness alteration with a bit more compassion and understanding for the human need underneath the seeking. And so we come to the close of our journey through the hidden world of medieval consciousness alteration. Through the mist of centuries, through the smoke of monastery incense, through the fog of fermented beverages and strange visions, we've traced the threads of how medieval people sought the same thing you seek sometimes late at night: a break from what is, a moment of what could be, a quieting of the endless noise of consciousness. The monastery bells have stopped ringing. The taverns are closing their doors. The last customers are stumbling home through cobbled streets, the effects of fermented grains and herbal preparations slowly wearing away, leaving them to process what they felt and what they saw. In hidden gardens, the last of the consciousness-altering plants sway gently in evening breezes, their secrets kept safe until someone with knowledge finds them again. What strikes us in reflecting on all this is how little has changed about the human heart. Medieval people and modern people reach for consciousness alteration from the same place inside, a place that desires relief, connection, transcendence, understanding. The friars. Substances have evolved, the contexts have shifted, the moral frameworks have transformed, but the impulse remains constant, continuous, deeply and fundamentally human. The women who knew the secrets of plants rest now, some in unmarked graves, their knowledge scattered to the wind. The monks who carefully tended their gardens while officially condemning intoxication or dust. The tavern keepers who understood consciousness as a commodity have been forgotten, but their legacy persists in every drink someone raises to their lips, in every medicine someone takes for pain, in every moment someone seeks to feel something other than what they feel in ordinary consciousness. You're close to sleep now, aren't you? The weight of all these stories, all these substances, all these medieval people, seeking and finding and suffering and healing in their own altered states, is heavy and warm, and it settles into you like the scent of incense settling into cloth. Close your eyes. Your breath is the rhythm beneath everything. Outside, the world continues its turning. In medieval Europe, in some other time, in some other place, people are still seeking what medieval people sought, still using substances that change consciousness, still hoping for relief, for connection, for transcendence. You understand them now. You understand why they did it. And understanding that, you can rest. Sleep gently, knowing that consciousness is vast and has room for many states. What medieval people knew, what you're knowing now, what humans will always know. Consciousness is ours, to explore gently, carefully, with respect and compassion for ourselves and for the human need beneath the seeking. Sweet dreams from the dark and candlelit corridors of medieval consciousness, alteration. Thank you for journeying through them with me.